All right. Oh, lost it. All right, everybody. Going to get started. Two quick announcements. One, we found a phone yesterday, and no one has claimed it, but it's a red iPhone. It's out at the table. I'm surprised no one claimed it. Okay. If no one claims it, I guess belongs to us. Secondly, if you had issues with the parking people yesterday, talk to Annie and get those figured out, because they're not very nice on the first infraction and they're really mean on the second infraction. So you don't want to mess with that. All right. I guess that's my announcement. Let me start with today's first session, thinking about kind of the longer term. What did I call this? Thinking about a sustainable future. Yeah, that's what we're going to do. We have two wonderful talks to get us started. And I described these talks when I first wrote about them as transformative change and aggressive incrementalism, and then I assigned these two talks to two different speakers. And I don't know if they even looked at the titles, or if they even know what I meant when I wrote those titles, and I'm not sure I knew what I meant either. So no one's holding anyone to that description. But I do know that both have some very provocative and useful ideas for us, and I'm very much looking forward to this panel. Our first presenter is Bruce Babbitt, and he's a man who needs no introduction, and will get no introduction from me, but his colleague Mark would like to do a proper introduction.
And I have to say, I'm not going to do the introduction that he probably deserves, but I will do my best to at least share a few thoughts about our first speaker with you. And let me just say how much I enjoyed seeing everybody having such a great time last night at the reception. Thanks so much for coming. It looked like we were all having a lot of fun. I know I was, so thanks for that. I want to just start, I guess, by acknowledging that I had a wonderful opportunity to work with Secretary Babbitt in the year 2000, in the last year of the Clinton administration. It seems like a lifetime ago. I can't believe I'm saying it's the year 2000, but it was a long time ago, but it's still very fresh in my mind. And I will say this, that Secretary Babbitt, of course, former governor of Arizona as well, he is, I think, surely one of the most talented public servants that we have seen in the last several decades. And I say that not just from observing him from afar, but observing him close up. I recall a meeting that we went to in the middle of Wyoming in a really bitterly cold February day with a very hostile crowd that was there to sort of protest what they thought he might do with the Red Desert. And he charmed them. I mean, we came out of there and I felt like the protesting that was going on outside had dissipated. And I felt like people didn't agree with him maybe, but understood what he wanted to do and respected that he came and he talked and he listened and he heard what people had to say. And that's the kind of public servant that Secretary Babbitt was and is. He has these unfailing political instincts that I think have served him well. The other thing that you should know about Secretary Babbitt is, and you probably sense this already if you know anything about him, but he has this unusually deep understanding of these complex issues that we face here in the Western United States, whether you're talking about public lands or endangered species, or in this case, water resources. This is a guy that digs deep into these issues. It's not a superficial kind of understanding. And when he is trying to make a decision about one of these important issues, he does so with great insights into what needs to be done, and I think always makes excellent decisions about how it should go. So we're really looking forward, Bruce, to hearing what you have to say about the Colorado River. Welcome, and join me, I guess, in welcoming Secretary Bruce Babbitt. So good to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. That was a marvelous introduction. What I like best is his, I think, perhaps dubious prediction that by the time I'm done speaking, I will have charmed the audience. Well, we'll see. We'll see. Well, I'd like to thank Doug and all the others for sponsoring a conversation that has drawn so many of the indispensable people for the future of this basin. It's been a great conference. We have more to go, but I think all of us really appreciate the effort that's gone into it. Now, I'd like to start with the last question that the slide people put up yesterday. I'm not sure it was fully answered. As I recall the question, it was, have we to date made any permanent reductions in water use in the basin in the last few years? Well, I'm glad I don't have to literally answer that, because it's not very clear to me what sort of permanent reductions have been made. And I think what we need to do looking toward the future is try to assess what kinds of institutional arrangements we can modify and put into place to really get a stronger consensus, not just about the apportionments among the states, but how it is we begin to look below those apportionments and engage with the water users in the basin about what kinds of institutions and arrangements are going to give rise to real reductions that meet the criteria that we talked about yesterday. Mainly that they be comprehensive, that they be voluntary, and that they have a financial structure in which agriculture and others are willing and ready to participate. Now, I am going to talk about not fewer participants, but actually broadening the level of participation and seeing if we can find and put together some architecture that will draw a even broader group into all of this. Now, what do we talk about in order to do that? Well, it's pretty clear to me, agriculture uses more than 75% of the water use in the basin. The Native American tribes have an estimated entitlement of 25% of the total use in the basin. So I think we've got to dig down and ask, how do we activate and motivate a broader set of participation that yields results? Let me start with the 85, 75, 80% for agriculture. It's clear to me that agriculture is a key participant, and we haven't done well. It's kind of a chaotic scene out there. The farmers that I'm familiar with think about a history of buy and dry. It's a dirty word, but every time we talk about agriculture, what about the buy and dry experience? You're going to be off to a very bad start. The next thing that comes up is the appearance of the hedge funds, the New York hedge funds, Water Asset Management, Greenstone, and the other speculators from Wall Street. Andy Mueller in the Colorado River Basin has what I think is the right approach. He says there are a bunch of speculators and vultures who have nothing to add, and they're disrupting the process way too much. A third approach that doesn't seem to be working is the system conservation pilot programs put together by some of us and the Bureau of Reclamation. The word I get from Colorado is, they ain't working. We don't like them. Farmers are suspicious. We think all of these programs are the beginning wedge to some version of buy and dry. We participate, the terms and conditions aren't clear, and pretty soon they're going to morph into buy and dry. We don't have a confident institutional take out there. I'm going to give you briefly 3 examples of what I think might work institutionally and how it is we need to engage, not just at this data portion level, but in building an institutional response. The first one, briefly mentioned yesterday, was the Palo Verde Irrigation District in California. It's a model we all need to understand. It was put together between the district and the Metropolitan Water District some 10 years ago. And it works like this. The district negotiates a framework in which individual farmers have the right to voluntarily engage in fallowing and rotational fallowing and similar kinds of programs. There's a cap on how much water can be transported to Met in any given year. And a farmer may or may not want to participate, can only participate once in every 3 years. There's no buy and dry. This is rotational fallowing. It's been a real success. Met can call for up to 30% in this rotational fallowing volunteer program. It's worked. The farmers have joined voluntarily, and there's more demand than there is available water under the cap. There are other programs like that that we need to try to understand so we can get together some consensus about moving on reduction. The super ditch in Colorado is another one that is built on these kinds of concepts. Jim is here later today. He can explain it in detail. Why do they work? Why is it that programs that are voluntary, that have group support, that have support from the farming community, seem to work? I'd like to leave you with one other example that we need to dig into and to draw into the discussion. And that is a program called the Conservation Reserve Program. Anybody ever heard of it? Well, we need to start looking for models that will work rather than just these random kinds of, we're going to go out and buy a year's water from X. We'll toss out a little bit of money here. The money will be 500 here, 150 there. No logic to what we're doing now. The Conservation Reserve Program is a Department of Agriculture program. And it pays farmers not to farm. Now, before you all go away and say that's not what we mean, that's the essential idea. You can paper it over a little more, but that's the essential idea. How do you provide a program in which there is voluntary participation in order to drive down to the appropriate level the amount of consumption? The Conservation Reserve Program, listen to these numbers. The Conservation Reserve Program has taken out of production 20 million acres of farmland. 20 million acres of farmland on a voluntary basis from farmers, farm bureaus, and organizations which unanimously support the program. Not unanimously, of course, but near. It is supported by an annual $2 billion appropriation from Congress. Now, what's the magic in that? Well, of course, it's different. The response in the short run, well, it's different. It's not about water. It's about retiring farmland. It's the Midwest. It's not the Colorado River Basin. I'm not saying it's an exact replica, but the fact is it is a program for the voluntary reduction of farming with clear guidelines about the pricing, about how long the contracts are for, beautifully put together and orchestrated. It's existed for a long time. And listen to those figures, 20 million acres, $2 billion in annual appropriations. We have a lot to learn, but it's not just going to happen. And as we go forward with all these negotiations, we're going to have to broaden our approach and get down to these institutional details, because there are solutions there, but they don't just happen when we continue to negotiate up here on the state apportionments and say something will happen. Well, what we're learning is things tend to be driven toward the kind of chaos and distrust that we now see in the agricultural community, based on what I've told you about. You look at all the negative examples, but we've got to get into the ones that work. Okay, that's a riff about the 75 to 80% of the water used by agriculture in this basin. Now, the other one that I think we need to dig into and really get our hands into discussions and negotiations and full-throated participation from the Department of the Interior. Now, that, of course, is Indian entitlements, which are, when you take the adjudications, settlements, estimates of unadjudicated, and much of which is unused, amounts to 25% of the water use in this basin. And we're kidding ourselves if we don't move toward an institutional kind of paradigm, some architecture that will get this process going and dealing with that. Now, we heard from the tribes yesterday, a lot of great ideas and important stuff there. Starting, of course, with the fact that the tribes are sovereigns. No sense going back and arguing about that. That, if anything is clear, the Supreme Court has laid that out in crystalline detail. But the irony of all of this is these discussions are now moving at all levels and in many ways on the assumption that some of the necessary, significant reductions in this basin are going to come from the tribes. Well, wait a minute. You heard yesterday, and I fully concur, the tribes are saying, look, you're speculating on our entitlements, which many of which have not been adjudicated. Even those which have been adjudicated lack infrastructure for us, the tribes, to make use of the water. The federal government has spent 100 years subsidizing infrastructure for everybody else. And some of our rights are not adjudicated. Those that are, well, you heard yesterday, do not have, in many cases, the infrastructure to manage it. Now, what is this going to take? The Department of the Interior must be the lead non-Indian participant in this. We need to understand that. And we need to turn to the Interior Department and say, look, if we're going to invite the tribes in to more participation, as indeed yesterday we heard many interesting viewpoints on that. If we're going to expect a response, we're going to have to get serious about working the unadjudicated claims, about providing infrastructure, because how can you ask us to participate in mandatory, organized, not necessarily mandatory, organized reductions when we haven't even gotten to the point of affirming and clarifying our rights and having the resources to put them to use? There's a profound disjunction here that we have to deal with. It seems to me, and I take much of this from yesterday's discussion, the first issue that we must deal with is in the hands of all of us, and that is, what is the right architecture for tribal participation? We made some progress, you heard it yesterday, the state level, but we still don't have a real comprehensive architecture that goes all the way across the basin with all of the participants. And we need to get at that. The tribes themselves have offered up various ideas of what that kind of participation might look like. There's still kind of an equivocal response among the non-tribal negotiators. But if we're going to move toward engagement, we must move toward not only consultation, but the tribes organized to participate in decision-making as sovereigns. And I repeat, the Interior Department can't just throw out some money and say, this will all happen. We have to move toward a real plan. If we do this on the tribal front, we can make it work. I mean, there are those who say, you know, if the tribal rights are all put to use, man, what's going to happen? We're going to start shutting down all sorts of, the basin's fully appropriated. The tribes step up to say, now it's time to utilize ours. How do you add it all up? Well, my advice is there's some good news out there in the basin that we are not paying attention to and incorporating into our discussions. And that model is the Gila River Indian Community Settlement in Arizona. It is a remarkable settlement, worked out over years with deep participation from cities, communities, irrigation districts, all sorts of people, in which the Gila Indian community emerged with a settlement involving not only existing water uses, but nearly more than 25% of the water coming from the Central Arizona Project. Now, how did that happen? How do you stack all that onto an already fully appropriated state system? Well, the answer is that the communities came together in an incredible negotiation in which the tribes and the participants utilized in a really inventive way every conceivable kind of joint management arrangement. Water exchanges, a forbearance, a conjunctive use of surface water and groundwater, water exchanges involving recycled water and project water, in which it was all accommodated. It wasn't easy, the signatories to the final settlement in Title II of the 2004 legislation, there were 35 institutional signatories to the settlement. There were 135 side agreements as exhibits to the settlement. And what it reflected was the participation of almost every town, city, village, irrigation district in central Arizona, who finally came to say, we've got to invent ways. Leasing, of course, a part of all of that. But you can't just start by going out to a tribe and saying, we want to lease your water. They're not in the business of getting entitlements just to give them away. And I would seriously recommend to all of you that you familiarize yourself with that agreement, because it's an enormously positive example of how it is in a fully appropriated basin. You can sort of look at folks who are showing up at new rights first priority and saying, okay, you know the downside, but we can find the upside. And again, I think that the negotiations now that go on have not reached down to the level of how do we encourage and manage and provide the space for these kinds of institutions. And I say again, we've got to do it together. I'm looking back on what we've done with this kind of, the states are out here, they're sovereigns who are negotiating their respective apportionments. The Interior Department's over here looking at all of this and saying, well, we'll occasionally have an idea. We will pass judgment. You come up with something to pass judgment. But I don't think that model works very well. We've got to integrate a lot more. And we've got to recognize that there's going to be money involved. Only a modest $1.5 billion so far. But that money most of it is going to be federal money. And inevitably, the feds, take your choice of who they are, but the feds are surely going to start looking at how that money is spent. It's taxpayer money. And there's surely going to be a move to broaden out the criteria by which that money is spent, rather than just throwing it over the transom. Let me finish now at 8:55 by turning to some comments about the two basins, upper and lower. I'm going to defer to Eric for much of that discussion, because he has surely been one of the most perceptive pioneers. I have another reason for confidence in Eric and deferring to him. We both grew up for parts of our lives in a small rural town out in Arizona. And in fact, we are both proud graduates of a nickel and dime public high school in what was then a small town called Flagstaff High School. But let me start and finish with a few thoughts about the upper and lower basin. We've not done a good job at all of communicating between the two basins. It wasn't necessary when there was enough water to go around. Everybody could go about their business and kind of forget about it. But now that it's not more but less, the awakening is taking place. And as I've suggested, we have to broaden our vision and participation. There are lots of issues, but the big one, which I will leave you with, is, of course, the provisions of the Colorado River Compact, which has two themes running through it, which are increasingly in direct conflict and will become even more of a difficult issue. Just to summarize, the compact, which all of you students are here, I'd urge you to read the compact. It's only 7 pages long. I mean, I know people don't like to read, but it's 6 or 7 pages long. And it is full of ambiguity, of difficult concepts, and it's important to internalize all of that. But for starters, I leave you with the conflict between Article 1, in which the compact states this is about equitable apportionment. And the record makes it pretty clear that when they drafted it, equity was on everybody's mind. Now go to Article 3, and specifically Article 3D, which imposes an apparently ironclad delivery requirement from the upper basin to the lower basin. It's not been an issue when there's plenty of water, but as the river goes down, here's what happens. The delivery requirement gradually erodes the amount of, some call it leftovers, so that's too strong, reduces the amount of leftovers available for use in the upper basin. So far, not a problem. The upper basin's uses haven't gone like that. They've kind of muddled along like this. And we're now working on ratcheting down the lower basin. But here, in my remaining 2 minutes, is the problem. The average river flow, for which I turn to Brad Udall and others, in the first 20 years of this century has gone down to 12.4 million acre feet. That's a 20% decline, which has taken us to the current situation. Now, if that trend continues and we get another decline of equivalent to that, say over the next generation, the delivery requirement against those numbers wrecks the assumptions about use in the upper basin. If you project, and these are all projections, we've got to deal with it. If you project a decline in stream flow equivalent to what has happened in the first 20 years of this century, it's about a 20% reduction. If you project that into the next generation with another 20% and begin to look at the delivery requirements, the upper basin will not only be having a discussion about how it uses more of its entitled apportionment, but it'll be looking like there will be drastic cuts in the existing level of use in the upper basin. This is not a 10 or 20,000 or 100,000. It's talking about 1 million, maybe more, maybe less, but that's the scale of it. And the upper basin has done a lot of very good analysis. You can read it, and it's really good. Eric Kuhn, Brad Udall, and others have put this all down on paper. The the scope of it is just crystal clear. What's lacking is a basin-wide discussion of what this means. The Upper Basin is busy writing brilliant academic papers. The Lower Basin so far has confined itself to arguing among lawyers about who has the best case in litigation. This disjunct is, it's really incredible that there's no real serious talk. Now, I'll finish on what I heard from Tom Buchowski yesterday. He said, we must come to equitable solutions that are fair to all parties based on the present reality. And that discussion of equity and the difference between lawyer arguments based on who has which senior right against who else has to be intensively moderated by discussions of equity. The scenario I've described in the Upper Basin is going to bring these issues forward. There's no other way around. The continuing discussions between Arizona and California, again, they've got the same problem. The lawyers arguing this is our absolute entitlement against others, and the equity issue of we're all in this together, and we've got to find solutions that really deal with those two differing concepts, and in my opinion, bring the equity discussions much further into the discussion than we've had. Thank you.
Thank you. That's fantastic. That tees up a lot of the discussions on our schedule today. Not only Eric's, but our next couple sessions will touch on several of those issues. So that's exactly what I was hoping for. All right. Before Eric comes up, let me again remind you that you can be submitting questions, and we'll do our Q&A after Eric talks. So let me introduce Eric. It mentions how did we list you in the program? Oh, as a former GM of the Colorado River District, which is true. And that was an impressive gig. I think he's a lot more powerful in this basin now that he's not in that job, and that he's an author, and he's such a nerd. His latest paper on evaporation, it's like, I could say that because I'm dying to read it. I haven't seen it yet. It's all really useful, thoughtful stuff. I often describe Eric as the sharpest mind in the basin, and I promised myself, I guess I just broke my promise to myself, that I'd stop doing that because I don't want to sound like I'm putting everyone else down. But what I mean is Eric is really sharp, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what he has to say.
Well, thank you, Doug. I guess I do even have a PowerPoint. So do I just advance it with here on the?
I guess.
Let's see. Oh, yeah, there we go. Got it. It works. First, I want to thank Doug for inviting me, and it's really an honor to be on the panel really on the same day, not only in the same hour as former Secretary and Governor Babbitt. That's incredible. I would never have envisioned it a few years ago. I also wanted to mention Brad, thank him for pointing out the paper we wrote and suggesting that our ability to put a title is somewhat at risk here. I mean, it's not a very good title where it's about the historical perspective of evaporation. But I will say that what we were trying to do, John and I were trying to do, is point out that we're having this great debate over some really, really tough issues. 75 years ago, they were having the same discussions. Very smart people, the same issues, the same unresolved issues 75 years later. And I think it's important that we go back and look at what the basin has failed to do in the past and some of the reasons that they couldn't address some of the issues and reach some compromises. And I think there's a lot of lessons in the history of this basin. And the other thing is everything we're doing today is pretty much the same as even 100 years ago. Now you think, well, what about the hydrology? And I just simply point out that in the late 1940s through the 1960s, they were talking about a structural deficit of 1.5 million to 2 million acre feet a year. And this was before climate change. Well, why? Well, just look at what's the inflow to Lake Powell. Climate change has reduced the inflow to Lake Powell by 2.5 million acre feet from what we thought there would be in the 60s, 70s, and 80s to today. But at the same time, back in the 60s, we assumed the upper basin would be using 6.5 million acre feet. Today, we're using 4.5 million acre feet. So they offset each other. So the structural deficit that Royce Tipton talked about and argued with the Senate about and argued with Arizona about in 1964 and 1965 of 1.2 to 2 million acre feet is what we're dealing with today. He got it right. He didn't get the hydrology right, but he got it right because he assumed the same sort of inflow into Powell because of his assumptions about how much water the upper basin would develop. So anyway, going on to that, we talk about equity, and this is, I like this one, is river flows a century ago versus today. And let's just point this out, that Delph Carpenter's report to the Colorado General Assembly in December of 1922, he laid out about 5 or 6 or 7 tables on the hydrology. And it's very clear that he was the most conservative of the 8 compact commissioners, and he assumed there'd be about 20.5 million acre feet basin-wide. Now, in those days, they were more concerned about how much water was available in the basin above the basically international border. Lee's Ferry wasn't quite everything today is Lee's Ferry. Well, then they talked about how much water was available in the basin. But you can see we've gone from a surplus of 4.5 million, and this is what they all told Congress, there would be a surplus of 4.5 to 5 million acre feet. This surplus would be used to satisfy Mexico. And in the future, we'd come back and we'd reapportion that. Basically, I think in October 1963, never happened. But we've gone from a surplus of 4.5 million to a deficit of 4.5 million. So the basic foundation is that this river's been over allocated from essentially 1922. Now, this lower basin structural deficit has consequences, and we talk about this, and I'll just go real quickly. If we assume the upper basin is delivering 8.25 at Lee Ferry, and there's about 750,000 acre feet of inflow between Lee Ferry and Lake Mead, you get 9 million acre feet of available supply. I would love the basin to start talking about how much water we have at Lake Mead, not how much water we have at Lee's Ferry, because I think that's the most relevant number in the basin. And things are happening, the climate change is affecting those tributary inflows as well. So we need to be aware of that. But if you take away evaporation and system losses to Mexico, the available main stem water for Arizona, Nevada, California, 6 million. It said in the recent draft EIS that pre-compact rights are present perfected rights. We call them pre-compact rights in the upper basin are using about 3.4 million acre feet. That's consumption. If you look at the consumptive use of post-compact senior ag, like most of Palo Verde is not a pre-compact right, even though their right goes back to 1879. How much they were using in 1929 was very small compared to what they were using today. And they went through a very rigorous process of documenting their present preferred rights in the lower basin. The upper basin is nowhere near that. But the bottom line is you've got a little over 1 million acre feet for Metropolitan Water District, CAP, in Southern Nevada. So the folks that serve, 27, 28 million people have a very small portion of the water, and that has consequences. We'll go into that in a little bit. The other thing, and then we talk about equity, the compact has given the upper division states a fixed numerator and a shrinking denominator. And back in 1922, when Carpenter was selling the compact, 8, 7.5, even 8.25. No, they had no idea that it would be 8.25 because there was no Mexican treaty, but that was less than half the water in the basin. Today, it's approaching 70% of the water. So you cannot have and continue to have an equitable situation in the basin when the upper basin has this shrinking denominator, because it really challenges the basic purpose of the compact, which is an equitable division of the consumptive beneficial use in the basin. And then finally, I want to talk about a couple things that Brad mentioned yesterday. 10-year deliveries at Lee Ferry, depending on your hydrology, they could drop below 82.5 million acre feet in 2026 or 2027, almost certainly by 2030. And remember, under the interim guidelines from 2015 to 2019, we had 5 straight years of a 9 million acre foot release. And well, what happens as that 10-year progressive number continue? Well, ultimately, we're going to replace those 9 million acre foot releases with 748s or 7s or even 825s. So even if we replace them with 825s, we drop the number below 82.5 million acre feet. So that's the issue that Governor Babbitt has said we're really not talking about. Now, I want to go on and point out that I think there's been the upper basin should learn from some of the things that the lower basin has done right, and the lower basin should learn from a few things the upper basin has done right. Now, I'll go back to 2007. And the folks that were representing Arizona at the time, Tim Henley and Larry Dozier and Herb Gunther, made it very clear that their goal was to transfer the risk of the CAP subordination or junior status, whatever you want to call it, to the rest of the basin. And I'm here to tell you they succeeded. They succeeded when the 2019 DCP California accepted a portion of the shortages, which is they didn't have to do under the law. And today, I give credit to Tom Bushofsky and Brenda, Ted Cook. They've made it very clear that Arizona sees no future in the Colorado River, maybe no peaceful future in the Colorado River, where the Central Arizona Project gets 0 water in a year. I think they've made that very clear. Now, I'm here to say as an observer that I don't see any peaceful future in the Colorado River where 4 upper basin commissioners are going to vote at the UCRC to curtail their own uses if flows drop below in 2026 or 2027, if flows drop below 82.5 million acre feet because of the equity issue. Because the Mexican treaty obligation has never, ever been discussed. So, I mean, that's where we're headed. But I think what the upper basin can do, and I would hope that those hear me, is be as straightforward as Tom Bushofsky is in Arizona, that going below 82, don't expect us to implement a curtailment if flows drop below 82.5 million acre feet. So they haven't quite said that. They have said it's, those deliveries to Mexico are a luxury, not a necessity, but they haven't been as clear. Now, what can the lower basin learn from what the upper basin has done. And I'll point out the upper basin has a compact, the lower basin doesn't have a compact. And that's really the story of our paper on evaporation. Back in 1948, when the basin was arguing in front of Congress about a number of issues, what had happened in 1947, the Bureau of Reclamation issued what's called a Blue Book. It was a comprehensive report on the development of the Colorado River. It had about every project you can think of that's been built today was mentioned, and a whole bunch of others. And it was an enticing list for the senators and representatives from all of the basin states. But the Truman administration basically said, wait a minute, we are not going to support any authorizations until you go back as states and finish the job of the 22 compact negotiations and negotiate sub-basin compacts. The upper basin was already doing that. They understood that. They hated that. I mean, that provision that was laid out in the transmittal letter of this report to Congress, I mean, Clifford Stone just said that was an awful requirement, but he understood that it was necessary. Now, so the upper basin negotiated a compact and the lower basin never has. When I look at what Arizona tried to do with its original filing in 1952 when it went to the Supreme Court, they essentially asked the court to give them the equivalent of a lower basin compact. They asked the court to define consumptive use. They asked the court to determine how main stem reservoir evaporation would be assessed among the individual states. They asked the court to split up all 8.5 million acre feet that the compact apportions to the lower basin. They won the case, but they got none of what they asked for in their original, what do you call them? What they asked the court to do, the court gave them none of that, but they still won the case. Because they won the case based on an interpretation of the Boulder Canyon Project Act. The court stayed away from the compact. So today there is still no accepted definition between Arizona, California, and Nevada of consumptive use under the compact. So how are you going to assess a reservoir evaporation to individual states when there's no definition of consumptive use and there's no split of the water that the compact is apportioned to the lower basin to the individual states? Now, again, the Boulder Canyon Project Act apportioned the water from a federal project to those 3 states. Rifkin was very clear that his decision was not the same as a lower basin compact, and in several places and in the transcripts, he hoped that the Arizona, California, Nevada could ultimately get together and finish the job and have a compact. Now, he feared that Arizona, Nevada, and California could never reach a compromise on it, and that has been the case. So you can see, one of the things that in the paper we're saying is we don't have to say it's a formal compact, but what if it's what if it's through Congress or whatever? You need to have some ground rules about consumptive use, about which states are using how much water. You need to have those basic ground rules in the lower basin in place. And I fear if we go into 2026 without thinking about some of those issues, at every opportunity that comes up, what's going to happen? We're going to have a fight between the lower basin states over how to split up the 1.5 million acre feet or 2 million acre feet of reductions that have to happen. So that's kind of my easy story, but I think there's a lot of reason for optimism in the basin. It's just the recent Arizona and California, Nevada agreement is not a perfect agreement, but my view is a very imperfect agreement is far, far better than no agreement at all. I remember Terry Fulp smiling at this, what you basically said about the 2007 interim guidelines, and it was true. So we are now in this era of aggressive incrementalism. What's the difference between incrementalism and aggressive incrementalism as well? Incrementalism that was successful, like the 2000 surplus guidelines, the record of decision on 602A, the interim guidelines, the DCPs. In my view, they were all sort of within the law of the river. They weren't easy. The QSA was not very easy, but everyone knew that California only had an apportionment under the Boulder Canyon Act of 4.4 million, and the rest was surplus. So going from 5.3 to 4.4 had to happen. It was within the law of the river. I think aggressive incrementalism should be defined as we're going to have to change some of these fundamental laws. We're not going to have to, it's not just changing reservoir operations and doing low-hanging fruit. It's we're going to have to change the basics of some of the law of the river, and the best example of that is the CAP subordination. And another example of that may be the 75/10 or the 82.5/10, whatever your perspective is. Now, finally, I'll sit down and mention that in Cornerstone, the book that Jason quarterbacked, Kathy Jacobs and I basically suggested that ultimately this basin needs a compact that's similar to the Upper Basin Compact, in that we have to apportion the water based, if we're going to apportion the water, we have to base it on percentages of what's available, not on fixed amounts. And I believe that applies to Mexico as well. In 1944, when we signed the treaty, or 1945, when it was ratified, we thought there was 18 million acre feet of water, natural flow at the border. Mexico got 1.5 million. Today, if there's 13 and they're getting 1.5 million, essentially Mexico's small share of the Colorado River has gone from about 8% to about 13% because we agreed to a fixed amount. Now, of course, there's the provision about extraordinary drought, but I don't see how climate change is going to be an extraordinary drought. There's going to be droughts within climate change, but it's sort of a new abnormal, if you want to call it that. But ultimately, I think that's the solution. And in our chapter, we do something else. We say, let's apportion the percentages. Let's also make a percentage apportionment up front for the tribes and for the environment. Now, that's going to be very difficult. This was an academic paper. And others have told me, well, that's a great idea, but these are from the tribes. You're just going to change, the tribes are just going to be fighting over what the percentage is and the percentages within the percentage that goes to the tribes. So it's not an easy solution, but I think it has to happen. I think we have to apportion the water that we have based on percentages. And that also means we have to have an active market so we can move water from where it's of less value to where it will be of more value. And unfortunately, that whenever you have a market, you're going to have speculators. The two go hand in hand. So I don't want to take up much more time because I know the audience has probably got some great questions for Governor Babbitt, and I'll sit down.
Thank you, Eric. Two wonderful presentations. I hope there's a reporter here from the Flagstaff High School paper that's kept. Very well done, guys. We actually are on schedule, and I assume we have some questions, Jason, ready to go?
Yeah, please keep sending the questions to the queue. We have a solid list.
All right. Well, I will let you handle this then.
Okay, thanks. Secretary Babbitt, Eric, you can anticipate the main topic that a bunch of the questions revolve around: equity and equitable apportionment. What does that look like in modern times? Eric, I know you touched on that to some extent already in your remarks, but the specific questions that have come in around this subject, I'll just read them. First, how does population change from 1922 figure into the equity discussion? If much more population is in the lower basin, does equity demand more water go there? That's one iteration. I'm grouping these. Second iteration. What role do new dams and diversions have in the future of a sustainable and equitable basin? Third, if we focus on equitable apportionment, would it be equitable for the upper basin to continue business as usual and make no commitment to reduce its demands. I'll stop there. Again, all of those are framed around the equity discussion.
That okay now? Okay. I'd be happy to defer them to Eric.
And I guess, when I look at equity, it's not 50-50, okay? It never was. I mean, if you look at Colorado's got a whole bunch of compacts, and 90% of the South Platte water goes to Colorado. That's an equitable apportionment. I guess equitable means that the folks that negotiated the compact are going to be able to sell it back home. That's sort of my definition of equitable. And the issues, upper basin, lower basin population, I think the Central Arizona project is the great example of population, because when this project was contemplated back in the 40s and 50s, it was to replace groundwater depletions used by agriculture. And no one really, they were concerned about not having water in a year, but if they didn't have water in a given year, so what? They would just go back to using groundwater. If the CAP replaced Arizona's groundwater overdrafts in 8 out of 10 years, it was a success. But now what does the CAP do? It goes to critical Indian settlements, and it goes to the 6 million or whatever people it is that live in Phoenix and Tucson. So the population issue has changed the fundamental purpose of the Central Arizona project. And that means we can no longer live in this basin with a subordinate, or I call it a subordination, with a junior status. As far as the upper basin is concerned, I think the question simply is, it's the same thing. The Salt Lake City, Cheyenne, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, the whole Front Range, they all live on relatively junior, similar to the CAP, Trans Mountain diversions. And you can't really take water away from them. And when you go to a curtailment, the West Slope is sitting there with lots of pre-compact rights. The West Slope's not using much more water than it was in 1922, actually. So where we're using more water, it's in Trans Mountain diversions, it's the same issue. The people, you cannot now take water away from Denver, Colorado Springs, or Evans, or whatever the town is on the Front Range. And so the people has changed the basic assumptions that were made about the priority system back when we were authorizing these projects. So I'm kind of going on and on. But I'm saying that that's the reality, is what growth is doing is changing how we view the reliability of these projects, and how the law is going to have to change to give them certainty.
I would add only one footnote. About a year ago, Eric and Brad Udall, Kevin Wheeler, and others wrote an article in Science magazine that I think should be required reading for everyone who thinks about this equity issue and the upper and lower basins. The article sets up a bunch of hypothetical trajectories about water supply and how it is you might reach mass balance by different allocation proportions between the upper and lower basin. It makes a tentative suggestion among all of these alternatives, which you can look at and play with. I read them as saying, in fairness, tentatively, I hope I'm going to quote you correctly here. Here we go. That an equitable vision going forward from today has a balance of some modest growth in the upper basin beyond the current approximate level of about 4 million, paired with considerably larger cuts in the lower basin, reflecting the way this has all evolved with such a huge part of the supply being used in the lower basin. I think it's the best discussion of fairness that I've seen, because it acknowledges that there's going to have to be some movement, some for the upper basin, but a lot more for the lower basin. Wow, I've passed the test.
For now.
The only other thing I would say is that equity is about fairness. And look, fairness is inevitably in the eye of the beholder. The best we can do is look at the obvious unfairness and try to look at all the balancing thing and make a judgment.
Wonderful. There are some questions that relate to fairness, more in the sense of the process for having these conversations and for making these decisions about what an equitable apportionment should be. So fairness in process as opposed to fairness in design. There is one follow-up, though, related to equitable apportionment, one follow-up that I think would be useful. Basing allocations in the lower basin, and I'm assuming that means lower Colorado River and the lower basin tributaries both. So basing allocations in the lower basin on flow percentages seems like a good idea. Would you advocate for a floor or minimum allocation for the states within this for human health and safety?
Okay. I don't think there's any question that if we were to go back in time, we should have done all the allocations on percentages as the upper basin has done. I'm skeptical about whether it's realistic to try to go back and untangle the numerical allocations and translate it into percentages, as desirable conceptually as that may be. I do think it's possible to go back and look at all these numerical allocations and work with them in a way that approximates, in a kind of untidy, complicated way, what you would get from a percentage allocation. I think that's an exercise which would be illuminating. I don't think you can literally do it, but we ought to be able to get closer to the concept than just sticking with a bunch of numbers that showed up in the compact and the Basin Project Act in 1928.
Anything to add, Eric, on that one? Would you like to add anything about the lower basin? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I agree obviously with Governor Babbitt that, unwinding these issues is, and turning these fixed contracts into a percentage is going to be difficult. But as I understand the CAP contract, it's not for a fixed amount, it's for what's left, after the senior contract holders get their water. So we may end up with something like that. My other long-term thought is in the lower basin has a geographic advantage to the upper basin. I actually think a long-term, very long-term future in this is the lower basin states work together to implement the kind of recycling, reuse, perhaps supplemented by desalinization on the lower in Southern California to essentially get MWD off the river in all but very unusual years. I think that is technically doable. Reusing, they're next to the ocean, they can reuse that water to extinction. And I think that's one of the solutions. So the lower basin is going to have to deal with what they've got now. And by taking MWD essentially off the river, by replacing it with local supplies and reuse and those kinds of things, it frees up some more water for the inland, if you want to call it, uses who don't have the same, who don't have the same geographic advantages that the Metropolitan Water District has.
Okay, we'll transition to the process questions that I was alluding to a minute ago, fairness and process. There are two that I'm going to combine and pair up. First one, do you think that the current methods by which we are seeking consensus across the basin are up to the task of reaching an equitable solution? Follow up to that, and this is specific to something that Secretary Babbitt mentioned. Secretary Babbitt, what are your thoughts on what your suggested architectural platform for tribal, federal, state, tribal engagement or collaboration around decision-making might be structured?
I keep looking to my fellow professor here. Maybe I can run down the clock by just, okay. Now, on this architecture issue, I confess some inconsistency. When we did the QSA, starting in 1999, I took a very aggressive approach. There wasn't a lot of consultation. Terry will remember this. It was kind of a cram down because the way, the nature of that overrun, as Eric mentioned, above California's apportionment, using surplus water, had a kind of characteristic that made it possible to do an adversary kind of cram. I'm not sure no, I know that model is not ideal for this new world in which equity is going to demand a broad spectrum of reductions negotiated and worked out in a totally new environment. This old model that went into effect after Arizona versus California in a time of plenty, in which everybody basically said, well, leave it to the technicians. States have water engineers. They'll all go off on some weekend and work it out, and it doesn't really affect us. Starting in 2000, totally different world. It doesn't work for just the technicians to go into the closet. Everyone's affected. We have to find a process which includes all stakeholders, not just arguing about state apportionments, but talking about how they are involved on the ground in making reductions through institutional arrangements that have the support of the farm community, of the irrigation districts, of all of the players that deal with prices, how you set them, how decisions are made, duration, details. And the architecture that we're using now doesn't get down to that. The architecture that we're using now is focused very heavily on states arguing about statewide apportionments and leaving the hard details to somebody else, and that somebody else really hasn't emerged. And I think we still have time, and we should drill down on this architecture stuff and involve stakeholders, penciling out what kinds of local institutions that meet these criteria of voluntary, acceptable to the farming community, of preserving the farming base, making sure there's no buy and dry kind of tail on all of this. Now, what that architecture should be is it's complicated. You heard JB yesterday sort of laying out a lot of kinds of considerations. We've heard from the Indian community about their concerns. We have not heard enough from Interior about how Interior should be participating at the ground level in the evolution of these discussions. Fair amount of that is going on, not enough, but with the Indian tribes for whom they have a trust responsibility. But if you look at the system conservation pilot program and all these other things, they're very thin. They don't really reflect institutional participation by Interior. What I learned from the Conservation Reserve Program is that that kind of federal participation in the granularity of it made that program work with the strong support of the farming community. Is something that we haven't quite got onto here. I forget what the question was, but
I think you knocked out the architecture piece of it for good measure. The first piece of it, and Eric, please feel free to go whatever direction you want, but the first piece of it was, do you think that the current methods by which we are seeking consensus across the basin are up to the task of reaching an equitable solution?
I don't know the answer, quite frankly. I think they have been to date when it comes to reservoir operations. They have not been when it comes to equity on environmental, tribal, and other kinds of issues. I go back to Salt Lake City. Some of you were there, I don't know, a year ago plus a few months, where John Ensminger said it's not clear to him yet whether the post-2026 negotiations are going to be about plumbing or they're going to be about the water use in the basin, the bigger pictures issues. So I don't know that I've seen an answer to that yet, and I'm assuming that the Department of the Interior is really grappling with that fundamental issue. What is the scope of these post-2026 discussions, and how much of it will really be a redo of the 2007 interim guidelines, or how much of it will be a redo of the other problems, the equity problems that are facing the river? I'm waiting to see how that evolves, quite frankly.
Okay, the equity questions just keep rolling in. So I appreciate that. And I'm going to respect the democratic will, right? So a follow-up question along these lines. Sorry. Yes. A big barrier to reaching an equitable solution is unequal bargaining power held by the affected groups. Do you have any ideas on how to equalize the bargaining power?
well, I don't think there's any magic solution, but we have been talking about that. For example, the Native American discussion yesterday, the undercurrent of all of that is bargaining power, with the tribes saying, we are sovereigns. We need more than consultation. We need to share in decision-making power. And that discussion seems to me very important in trying to get something into the process agreement going forward as to how we do that. I would like to just say a word about the environmental issues, because it's something that I'm not entirely clear about what it means in terms of process. We actually have some very good environmental agreements that have come about, driven by the Endangered Species Act for fish and aquatic species, both in the upper basin and in the lower basin. We heard some of them described in terms of the operation of Flaming Gorge yesterday. The process known as the MSCP in the lower basin, Multi-Species Conservation Plan, came about without much notice and a lot of participation, and it has worked its way into a rather impressive number of discussions, particularly in the tribal management issues in the lower Colorado. There may be some lessons about process and architecture in the endangered species settlements. Memory fails me as to what it was all about. I apologize, but I think many of us are starting to understand that issue as well.
Yeah, Brad mentioned yesterday about one of the other observations or recommendations from the paper that Kevin Wheeler and a few of us did, which is it's really time to look at Powell and Mead as a system. It's the days of, that Lake Powell is the upper basin's reservoir and Lake Mead is the lower basin's reservoir, and they don't touch each other except for what's required by the law of the river. I think those are over. And what I could hope we could see in the future is if the risk of a curtailment on the upper basin, especially the central Utah projects and the Denver waters and the Colorado Big Thompson projects and those kinds of things is off the table. There's no reason. The purpose of Lake Powell becomes very different to the upper basin, and using those two reservoirs tandemly can provide some benefits to the lower basin, some environmental benefits, some power benefits, and some recreation. I mean, that we can bring those issues up to co-equals, or even those would be the reasons we operate the reservoir. It's no longer primarily for compact purposes. And I think that's where we need to get with those two reservoirs. And that's going to be a hard slog because of culture, but I think it's very doable. It is as doable as the 2007 jump in the way we operated Powell before to the way we operated it after. And that next step is look at the two of them together.
All right. One more process-related question in this vein. It's a really specific one, so I was hesitant to ask it. I need to set the stage for it. So Title 43 of the Code of Federal Regulations has a Part 417, right? It addresses procedural methods for implementing Colorado River water conservation measures with lower basin contractors and others, Part 417. The question is, can you expand on how Section 417 might be implemented and perhaps applied to both the lower basin and the upper basin?
I have been a consistent advocate of the use of Section 417. It was used in the QSA process 25 years ago. Without getting into a lot of detail, basically an interior regulation which says that the secretary may assess in terms whether or not the water is being, Terry, am I right, beneficially used? Okay. And that there's a world possibilities and problems. The possibilities, seems to me, are obvious. Those contracts are for under Section 5, have a lot of discretion implicit in them about how well the water is being used. Interior regularly, apart from 417, goes back and says, here's your water order for this year. We need to take a look at it to make sure that it's consistent with the contract. 417 goes a little bit further in the same kind of concept. It says we're going to really look at beneficial use. What is beneficial use? And that gets pretty interesting. And that's where this health and safety thing starts to get in. I think, and I've advocated, that it's an important way for Interior to demonstrate that it's really engaged in the process. It wasn't used by Interior this time for reasons known to them. It provoked some litigation in 2000 when we began to use it. And there are some ambiguities. I think Terry and others might say that the fact that 417 was in play helped get us toward a conclusion, okay? Having said that, I'm not passing judgment. I am suggesting that it is something that Interior should further the discussion of what it means, how it is it can be used, and so forth.
Yeah, the issue in the upper basin difference, of course, is that in the lower basin, what handful of major turnouts and contracts, less than 20, I think is what Chuck Cullum said, or less than that. All of them are under contract with all Lake Mead water has got to be used by a contract. The upper basin, there's thousands of individual little entities, and maybe 20% of the water is subject to some sort of Secretary of Interior control because they represent reclamation projects. So there are different worlds in the upper basin when it comes to that. And I think a different, broader approach has to be used in the upper basin.
Got it. Doug's given me the signal to kind of wrap it up. There's one question that I think ties things together nicely by panning out a little bit from the Colorado River Basin. We have an established doctrine of equitable apportionment in the United States, and this doctrine of equitable apportionment applies in other interstate river basins in the United States. Do you have any thoughts on how we can apply those equitable apportionment principles, either on paper or as applied in the other basins, to the Colorado River Basin?
That's kind of beyond my pay grade. I haven't really thought outside the Colorado River Basin. I get your question, but I'm not sure that I have any wisdom before I exhaust my limited capabilities on this. Okay.
All right, thank you, both of you. That was wonderful, and thank you, Jason, as well. It's time for a break. You guys know the routine. Be back in 30 minutes, and we'll talk agriculture.
I don't know. What's that? No, not the cowbell. No, thank you very much. Okay, so Jason. So that's fine. I'm going to do real quick introduction. You can start. I have a number of students here. Really? All right, I'm going to get started. Nah, it's all right. You don't need to introduce me. Do you want to? I mean, you don't want to. Okay. All right, so we're going to get started. If you can grab a seat. I know a lot of people are going to be filtering in over the next few minutes, so let's try to get going so we don't lose our time. They're starting to filter in. I don't know. You think it's all right? Okay. All right, so I'm going to get started. I know people are going to be filtering in as we go here, but we want to try to stay on our schedule as best we can. So I just want to thank the first two speakers for setting us up very well for this panel. This panel, which I think Doug cleverly titled, is going to look at how agriculture can thrive with less water. Hopefully we can show or present you with some ideas about how that can happen. I think there are a lot of provocative things to say about this topic, and I hope that leads to a very robust discussion about the issues we're going to confront. We have full bios for all the speakers on this panel, so please feel free to look at those. I will just very briefly introduce them now in the order in which they're going to present. So I'm going to start off first. Most of you know me. I'm Mark Squillace. I'm a faculty member here at the law school. And then we'll be followed by Jim Holway, who's the founding director of the Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy at the Lincoln Institute. Jim will be followed by Megan Scott, who is an attorney with the Noble Law Office. Megan represents irrigation and water districts in Arizona and California. And Pat O'Toole is going to wrap us up. Pat is a rancher, former state legislator, and president of the Farm Family Alliance. Okay, so that's the sort of roundup here. We're going to all try to stick to 15 minutes. So it's going to be a little bit of a speed dating exercise, I think, but let's try to get through it as best we can. I want to just sort of set the theme, I guess, for what I want to say about this issue. And we've heard this from a number of people, Becky Mitchell, Bruce Babbitt this morning, about the need to reduce consumption. And I would add, and I think Becky and Bruce both made this point, we need to permanently reduce consumption of the water we're using on the river. Short-term temporary reductions aren't going to be enough. So this slide you may have seen because it appeared in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago, really interesting article where it kind of lays out in a nice diagram fashion where all our water is going on the Colorado River. And as Bruce Babbitt indicated today, according to this slide, at least, it's 79% that's going to irrigated agriculture. And an interesting carve out that they make here is that 55% of that water, of actually the entire water basin, is going to alfalfa hay, grasses, and corn silage. So there's a link on the slide to the New York Times article where this appears. It's a pretty interesting story. You can see that by contrast, domestic residential use is pretty small. Some of the other crops use a fair amount of water. I was surprised at cotton, but wheat and corn and barley obviously using other water resources as well. But obviously we all know that it's this livestock feed that's the big user of water. So I want to sort of set up my discussion here by suggesting something to you that may seem a little radical or a little out of the ordinary. We've talked a little bit about the Colorado River Compact. You know, what does it mean? Can we continue to use it? And I've largely decided, at least for my own purposes, that the Colorado River Compact is really not what we're using anymore to manage the river. I mean, yes, there are certain questions that it still raises, and we talk about it. And I'm not suggesting that we ditch the 1922 compact. I am suggesting that maybe we need a new basin-wide agreement. And maybe that should take a form of a new compact among the states, among all 7 states, not as Eric was suggesting, the lower basin needs a new compact. Maybe they do, but maybe all 7 states need a new compact. And I want to just throw out an idea about what a new compact could look like, because I'm not thinking about allocating the water this time in the basin, but there was an interesting comment that was made yesterday on the panel by Tom Bushatsky about how difficult it was for Arizona to basically adopt new stringent standards of some kind or another, because there was so much political pushback on trying to get those kinds of things done. And I think we see that in all the states. And there's an interesting model that I suggest we might want to look at, which is the Great Lakes Basin Compact that was agreed to a number of years ago, not maybe 10 years ago now. And why I think that's interesting, I should add, by the way, that I've been fairly critical of the Great Lakes Basin Compact for the very reasons that Eric Kuhn was suggesting earlier. I thought they should have divided up the lakes based upon a kind of percentage of use. And so I don't necessarily think that's a model for everything, but one of the interesting things they did that we could perhaps learn from is they got all 8 basin states to agree to modernize their water laws in certain ways, so that nobody had to step out and be the only person that was going to fix this or address a particular problem that might come up. All states agreed to modernize their laws in a somewhat uniform way, so that nobody was asked to basically do more than any other state. And if you think about the kinds of things that we could do if we could all agree to it, or at least the kinds of things we could start talking about doing if we would get together and try to agree to these things, I think we might make some progress. So I want to just throw out 5 ideas, again, somewhat controversial, I'm sure. And the first one, maybe the most controversial, I think we should close the basin to new appropriations, full stop. Bruce Babbitt suggested that maybe the upper basin should get a couple more, 1 million acre feet, or not a couple million, but at least some additional allocation because maybe they deserve that. I understand that. That's an interesting argument. I would point out, by the way, that we have 2 reservoirs being built on the Front Range right now that are going to be taking more water out of the Colorado River before long. So there is still some kinds of appropriation going on here in the Front Range, in the upper basin. And I just wonder whether we can afford to do that, particularly if we're going to satisfy the needs of the tribes. I mean, you know, obviously there has to be an exception for tribes if we were to close the basin, but if we're going to provide the water that the tribes are entitled to receive and build the infrastructure that they need, we can't just keep appropriating water. And I would add, we need to include tributary groundwater if we're going to close it. Now, maybe it's not a full closure. You know, there are lots of things to talk about here, but I think we need to sort of get our arms around any additional appropriations that are allowed in the basin. I've also thought, and a number of people have mentioned this, it's a little complicated, obviously. All water rights in the basin are different. A lot of them have already been defined in terms of consumptive use, but I think all of our water rights should be defined in terms of consumptive use, because what I think we need to be doing is drawing down that consumptive use. We need to figure out ways, okay, you're consuming X, are you willing to give up Y? And so now you have X minus Y, and you can keep farming. You can do what you want to do, but with X minus Y water instead of the full appropriation that you had. We can buy down those rights. I want to see that done permanently. And I think we need to start thinking about how we're going to buy down those rights. And I'm concerned, frankly, about some of the ideas of buying these things down on an annual basis or a 2 or 3 year basis, because I think we're not going to have the money that we need to do that permanently. A couple of other ideas, and I'm sure there are others, and this is not a comprehensive list. This is just a list of some things we might be thinking about. I think Bruce was talking about beneficial use a little bit earlier today, and many of us have talked about this issue of beneficial use not really being a stringent enough standard to deal with the concerns about waste. I don't know what the right definition is, but I do think that maybe it's worth a discussion about whether we should tighten down our beneficial use standards in a way that could disincentivize consumption of water. We can talk about the no injury rule. I mean, this is not so much a discussion about transfers, except I think as there's less water available in the basin, there's going to be probably more interest and demand for transferring some water to people who might need it. And we've all suffered, I think, with the no injury rule for a long time. There are good reasons for the no injury rule. I just wonder whether we can't modify it somewhat. Are de minimis injuries really enough, not just to stop a project, but to vastly increase the cost of engaging in a transfer through the transaction costs that are associated with doing that? You know, we've had this standard in terms of harm that occurs when conjunctive use is made, when we're having surface and groundwater conflicts of material injury, and I wonder if that's not a more realistic standard. Again, I don't want to suggest that this is an exclusive list. I just think we could talk about these things and maybe reach agreement that all states at the same time are going to try to modernize their laws in ways that will make it easier for us to save water, maybe without even having to buy it. All right, so I want to talk about these 3 ideas for reducing consumption. And again, I'm focused on reducing consumption on a permanent basis. Deficit irrigation, crop switching, and rotational fallowing, which also got a little audience this morning from Secretary Babbitt. All right, so let's start with deficit irrigation. Two different flavors of this. Simple deficit irrigation is basically just giving up your last yield of alfalfa or a similar crop where you get multiple cuttings, maybe your last two, depending on how many cuttings you're taking. That's a pretty easy thing to do. You know, there's plenty of information about how that might be done. I'm going to point to a study that's been done that would suggest how much water we might actually get if we engage in simple deficit irrigation. I also want to talk briefly about RDI, or regulated deficit irrigation, which also provides some very significant opportunities to save water. So the study I wanted to point to was this Pacific Institute study that came out a few years ago, and a number of the authors and co-authors are here today, and they could probably talk more about this. But there's one really interesting statistic that I pulled out of that study, which is that we could garner 843,000 acre feet of water if we simply bought out the rights to the last cutting or two of alfalfa in the lower Colorado River Basin, mostly in California. And the study estimates that it would cost us $62 an acre foot per year. And that figures out to about $51.7 million. Now, again, I'd like to see this talked about on a more permanent basis. I think we could do it. I would love to see the study authors maybe update the study. Maybe they have some new information that would help. I'd love to see a number on what it would cost to do this permanently, but that's a lot of water that we could get simply by giving up the last cutting or so of these livestock crops. Okay, then what about RDI, regulated deficit irrigation? So here we're talking about applying water to crops just as they're becoming stressed. And so if we wait a little longer before we start applying that water, we may be able to significantly reduce water consumption without really adversely affecting, or at least significantly adversely affecting the amount of yield that we're going to get. This is a chart that I put together for a study that I did on water transfers. And one of the neat things about what we're talking about now is, with transfers, of course, we're constantly having to deal with injury issues, the no injury rule. But this, now we're talking about just buying down the rights. So there's no, you don't have to sort of go through a transfer process. You just basically buy out the rights that previously existed. If we look at sort of simple DI, we could save about 25%, or excuse me, about 33% of the water with a potential 25% reduction in yield. If we did it with corn or maize, we can save 24% of the water. This is RDI now, no significant reduction. Now, I should mention that RDI requires more infrastructure. It's not something that you can do just in the current way that you're irrigating. But if we're paying farmers to switch to regulated deficit irrigation, then they should be able to implement these new techniques in order to save a chunk of water. Almonds, you can save 11%, small decline, not terribly significant. Pistachios, you can see 23%, citrus, 25%, and limited impacts on the yields that we're seeing here. There are studies, these are all based on studies, by the way, that are cited in my article. There are other studies that are available now on other crops like pecans and other things, and it's a pretty interesting way to think about drawing down the demand that we have for water. Let me just briefly turn to crop switching, which is another way that we can deal with this. So let's say we decided to buy out that last cutting or two of alfalfa in the Imperial Irrigation District, and the farmer now has a different amount of water, X minus Y, the water that they previously had. They could just continue to grow alfalfa and not accept that last cutting, or maybe they'd switch to another crop. And it's really interesting if you look at the other crops that could potentially provide a good living for a farmer, how much water you would save if you switch to them. Again, these are all based upon scientific studies that have been done about the amount of water that you consume with different crops. So switching away from alfalfa, which is kind of the baseline here that we're looking at, you can save anything from, you can see the numbers, 44% all the way. I don't know why sweet potatoes uses so little water, but 71% reduction in the amount of water that you would save from growing that particular crop. And again, this is not telling a farmer what to grow or how to grow it. It's merely saying that if you switch to this kind of system, you would save a lot of water, and maybe that would be something we could pay farmers in order to incentivize them to do. Bruce Babbitt talked about the rotational fallowing and the PVID earlier today. It is a really interesting program. Note one big advantage over the PVID program is that, again, we're not having to deal with the transfer any longer. Now, one of the reasons that PVID has worked so well, and one of the reasons that the Super Ditch program has been much more difficult to implement is because it's a transfer. And again, we're dealing with lots of complicated rules about whether you can transfer water. But if you're simply buying down a right, by permanently asking somebody to engage in rotational fallowing, then it seems to me that you are not having to go through any kind of administrative process. You're just paying for that particular buy down. So any of these systems could really work to save a lot of water. I'm really big on trying to buy these things down permanently. As I said, we're going to be spending a lot of money anyway. We've got some money from the government to now do some of these things, but I'd hate to see us waste our money on temporary things when we know that we're dealing with a really permanent problem. And so that's what I'd like to see. And I think I've just finished in my time. So thank you very much. And I'll turn it over to Jim. I don't know how this works exactly, but you have slides here though, yes.
Yep, there you go.
That's you. I don't know how to do this. Go ahead.
All right, good morning, everybody. And so I'm gonna ask you to sort of join me in switching gears here a little bit. I know I'm in a room full of big picture, basin-wide policy experts. I want to take us to the other end of that spectrum of where do these decisions actually get implemented. I mean, the work of the Babbitt Center is very much focused on who's making that land use decision and how do we build the capacity of those individuals to handle the kind of decisions that might come out of the discussions we've had today. But in the end, it's who's actually using that land. It's the landowner, it's the farmer, it's the city, town, or irrigation district that pass rules that shape the environment which those decisions are made. That's where this stuff gets implemented. That's where our work focuses. Probably also should spend a second or two on, since Bruce started us off today, what is our relation with Bruce Babbitt? So Bruce is not responsible for anything we at the Babbitt Center say. We are part of a foundation, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, that's been around for, I think, 77 years now. And Bruce was a board member. Bruce's last board meeting was when we created a water policy center and told it we wanted it to focus on the Colorado River. And so Bruce is a valued advisor. I frankly started my career implementing Arizona's Groundwater Management Act, which was signed by Bruce Babbitt when he was governor. So long history there. The other thing I would point out is, as we go through, I've got a lot more details in the slides than I'm going to spend time presenting or will absorb, but my understanding is all the slides will get posted, so you'll have a chance to take a look at them. So, why is agriculture critical to the Colorado Basin? Obviously, we all know this. We've talked about it. I just want to focus briefly on the right-hand side of what is this future agriculture faces. And I think we all understand it's going to be a future with less water. The water is going to be more expensive. It's going to be less reliable. And there's going to be increasing competition. And those are just some of the challenges that agriculture as an industry we know faces. So we have this challenge that's the subject of this panel of how do we find a sustainable future for that agriculture. And so within the Babbitt Center, we've mostly been focused on more urban areas to date. So as we start to focus on agriculture, that's what I'll be talking to today, a bit about what is the work we're getting started, what are we hearing, what are we getting as responses, and where are we going to head next. So one of the first efforts we started on, and we've been doing this for about 3 or 4 years now, is working with the Public Policy Institute of California around work in the San Joaquin Basin and the implementation of California's Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And just sharing a few highlights here of some parts of that work that we have helped fund and sometimes have been involved in is the idea that will, I think, resonate throughout all of our talks, is that we really need to have all water users and stakeholders collaborating. We need to get everyone to the table. Often agriculture is not at the table. We've heard about often how tribes are not at the table. These are things we need to deal with. One of the findings they had is depending what these groundwater savings groundwater sustainability agencies that are set up to implement Sigma get put in place, that depending on the decisions they make, they actually could increase the risk to the communities in the basin if they don't aggressively move forward with the goals they need to do. And again, I think a theme that will come back again is there's a lot of potential in agriculture-urban partnerships, in particular on increasing groundwater recharge and in some water trading that can make this all more efficient. Another piece of work they did was looking at water-limited agriculture and what's the potential for that. I mean, very little potential in the arid Southwest for no irrigation, but significant potential, with much less irrigation, to both have some agricultural production, keep the land producing some revenue, but also prevent that land from becoming a source of dust and tumbleweeds and other noxious things to the larger community. And then one of the things that we particularly funded was looking at what's the potential for solar production on farmland, either in combination or instead of the farming, to continue a revenue source to those landowners. What's that potential? The next thing I want to talk about is some work that we started last summer, went into the fall. And it was, you know, before we get involved in agricultural work, what we really ought to focus on is what's the perspective of the ag producers. So Faith Sternlieb and Nike Obijan from our staff with a crew of 3 interns, and then I'll talk about a student that did some help for them as well, conducted a series of about 80 interviews. So this was simply going out to ag producers. We got to 5 of the 7 basin states. We selected particular irrigation districts and basins we wanted to talk to. Some of you probably either talked to us or told us who we ought to go talk to. And the purpose of this wasn't so much for us to do extensive research on it. It was, we're going to listen and then we are going to reflect back what we heard. And so we are just in the middle now of finishing the analysis and we'll start to write up. So over the next month or so, you will start to see us produce some products saying, this is what we heard. And so I'm going to go through a little bit of that briefly here. What you see here is what are the questions we were asking about? You know, what did we want to hear from folks? And forgetting to hit that. This excludes the California part of the analysis, which is a little different. But what you see here is we came up with 21 some challenges from these conversations, and here's the one that were listed at the top 5. So you see, you know, water appearing very high, both in water policy and drought, as well as urbanization. Frankly, I thought labor would be higher on this. It's just a matter of which districts I think we were talking to. But these are what we heard of as the top challenges. In terms of the perspectives and what we learned, multiple things here, and I'll just highlight a few of them. A key one was, and I think we've heard this before, is that for the agriculture industry, what they really feel like they need is the general public to understand them better. You know, we heard repeatedly that there was a sense that they were misunderstood and misaligned. And particularly for policymakers to be better informed about what's the reality of agriculture, that's not well enough understood. In the upper basin, there was a real sense of a need for more water storage capacity, because obviously the big storage capacity is below them, not above them. And that we were seeing people indicating that they were particularly diversifying their operations in the upper basin, some experimenting with lower water use crops in the lower basin. The other thing that, again, I think hopefully we all recognize this is water is not the primary basis on which farmers are making their decisions. It's, you know, what are the markets? What is their debt? What's their ability to get a loan? What will the banks give them a loan for? What's the capital investment they already have? What's the equipment that prepares them to farm what they're going to farm? And increasingly labor are issues in terms of what are their constraints on what they can do. And one of the things that really came out was that there's a very big need for better communication about climate, water availability, particularly to the smaller farmers. And I think we heard a bit of this in Brad's presentation that we had that started us off. A lot more people need to understand the kind of issues Brad was talking about, and generally speaking, they don't. There was, like I think I briefly mentioned, a separate effort, a graduate student we funded did some work specifically in California, and similar results, but I'll point to just a couple differences here. Something added to the major issues for the farmers in California was regulations. Water wasn't rated as highly in their list of issues as you saw it from the other basin states. Something I think we saw from many of the people we talked to is that the farmers felt a pretty significant sense of security in terms of their water rights, that, hey, my neighbor might have problems, or Pinal County in central Arizona might have problems, but we're good here. We have the most senior rights, we're good. And so that we saw that a lot of places. The other thing that was interesting was, well, not too surprising here, but the very large farmers, the large operations, they knew what was going on. They were engaged, they were going to meetings, they had the resources to do that. They could hire experts to help them. But we have a lot of smaller farmers out there that, to a surprising degree, farmers in the San Joaquin Valley of California that don't even know there is a Sustainable Groundwater Management Act being implemented by the state around them. A lot of that amongst the smaller farmers. So again, that need for communication, that need to give more technical assistance. And the person interviewing in California was sort of surprised that found not much interest in collaborating with other farmers. One, they just didn't have time, the smaller farmers. And second, well, that's my competition. Why would I be collaborating with them? So, a little bit surprising there. And again, as we said, this sort of sense of both a lot of pride in being a farmer, but a defensiveness in the sense that we're not understood and we're misaligned, and people need to understand us better and the contributions we're making that they're very proud of. They're feeding the country, they're feeding the world. Okay, that's probably enough on that one. Switching gears here. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but the latest exercise we've been doing is to do scenario planning with communities. And the idea here is, how do we help a community build that path to a more sustainable agricultural future? And the recognition that, yes, this impacts farmers, but what it really impacts is the rural agricultural communities in the West. As I've said a few times, if we don't sustain rural agriculture, we will hollow out the rural West and we'll all migrate to cities. This is what we see in third world countries. So we need to be conscious and careful about that. I'll go quickly through some slides here. This is a process we just did in Grand Junction area with Mesa County, and a workshop in March, and we're just kind of wrapping it up now, and we will have things coming out. And Arizona State University was our partner in this effort. So, what is exploratory scenario planning? It's the idea of thinking about what are the driving forces that are going to impact our future. It's recognizing that uncertainty. It is not, what do I want my future to be? It's not, what do I think my future is going to be? It's, what are the multiple futures I could face so I can start to prepare for them? So it starts with, what are the driving forces that are going to impact that future? And how do those driving forces turn into different end states we might have? We use that to identify top scenarios, and then we use those top scenarios in a bunch of breakout groups amongst a group of 40 or 50 people to talk about what are the actions they could take if they find themselves in those different futures. So what you see on the left here in bold is the top driving forces that came out of the process, and the numbers are with 5 breakout groups, how many voted for that. We started with 30 driving forces we got through interviews that the university did. We worked with the local steering committee to reduce it to 13, and then we asked these breakout groups to do 5. So then they took those 5, and we said, now, okay, for each of those 5, think about some end states that could occur. And what you see here is, out of a list of multiple end states, the whole group came together, they put dots on flip charts, and these were the top 6 end states they came up with. And then the next step in that is to take these end states, put them on these large matrices, and then that creates scenarios at the intersection of these end states. And so we went through this process now with 4 different groups. As you can see, all the charts are up there on the wall, and they're going around with sticky dots, and they're voting. Okay, of all these scenarios, which are the top 6? They all got 6 dots that I think we should talk about, that our community needs to be ready to deal with. And again, we tried to tell them, you're not putting the 6 dots on your 6 favorite futures you really want to happen. You're putting them on the 6 that we need to be prepared for. And so here's the top scenarios, really not looking for you to read them. The point I just wanted to make here is, you can see like the first 3, they actually added in a 3rd end state. So they combined scenarios. And then the next 3 are individual ones. Actually, I'll skip through this one and go right to this one in the order of time. So that first one was the best case, and what you're looking here is, what was the worst case one? So they said hotter and drier, infrastructure and development costs are going to increase, And urban development is going to urbanize on top of ag land. We're going to lose ag land to the urbanization. That really was a worst case scenario. So half these scenarios had a hotter and drier future, half of them did not. Where we went from there was, okay, if you're in this scenario, what should we do? 10 minutes on that. Okay, if you're in this scenario, what you should do. And so what you see here is one group going through this process. And if you look at scenario one, what's highlighted right at the, well, not highlighted, but right at the top there, the comment was that this is the future we'd aspire for. And then on the third one, which was what we said was the worst case, it's like, okay, this is a scenario where the desert has basically arrived and agriculture is unviable in our region. And so what are the different strategies we would do in each of these? Then we had a talk with them that said, okay, for these different strategies, how should you think about these? How should you decide what to focus on? And so an obvious one at the bottom of the list is robust. There was one strategy that got suggested, and they came up with 250 strategies. There's one strategy that got suggested that was like, well, this works in multiple scenarios, that's robust. But you also need to think about these worst case. If this happened, what should we immediately do? Because this is really bad. And then the transformational we need to think about. What are some ones that we really need to make significant changes to make happen? And on the list at the bottom, you can see the one that went sort of behind the title of Eric's talk, the incremental flexible. That's that aggressive incrementalism, which is maybe more where we've been. I'm going to slip right past this, but it'll be in the presentation. You can look it up. We met with them a month later, a smaller group of leaders of this, and they said, okay, of these 44 different kinds of strategies, here's the 13 we're going to prioritize. And they've started to implement them. We're continuing to provide funding to the Conservation District to go through this process. They're looking at creating a watershed group to facilitate collaboration. They're developing local markets. And then there's these other more transformative things they could do. In terms of what's next for us, we are now in about 2 months, we're going to do a similar workshop in Cochise County, Arizona. So 2 groundwater basins with some pretty serious challenges, the Wilcox and Douglas basins. We're having conversations with some local community folks and with the Nature Conservancy about perhaps doing this workshop in San Juan County, New Mexico, which would be a very interesting place to bring it. What I'll just conclude with is we're working on a policy report where we want to look at, basically, it's a call to having not necessarily just scenario planning, but we need to have conversations with rural communities. We need to involve them in this. And so what are some methods that we can effectively have these kind of conversations? And then some other things we'll start looking at. I'll stop there, and maybe then in the Q&A, there'll be time for some of the personal reflections that I would add to this. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to sort of give a quick overview of agriculture in the Yuma area and sort of just give a perspective on how we have evolved over time and how we do agriculture and sort of talk about whether or not there's more that we can do in the future. So Yuma agriculture, or the Yuma area agriculture, is a $3 billion industry. We grow over 175 different crops, most of those being vegetables, lettuce, leafy greens. I've listed some of those there, and you can see those. We grow year round. We have two really true growing seasons. We have some growers that will actually do 3 rotations and fit in a crop between those 2 main seasons. And during the winter months, we grow 80 to 90% of the nation's leafy greens and other vegetables, and even send some of those to Canada. And so kind of the statistics there are that we grow more than 1 billion pounds of lettuce per growing season, or more than 15 servings per person in the nation every year. And that's just lettuce. So that doesn't include the other vegetables that I've listed here. And just as a fun other statistic, around 2,500 trucks leave Yuma daily during these months. What makes this possible? I've listed those things there: soil, water, climate, infrastructure, innovation, clear access to labor, And really the Yuma area is irreplaceable in terms of those winter months because we're really the only place that doesn't have weather challenges. We have sun. We kind of have all of the things that are needed that really don't exist in the other parts of the country during that time period. As far as our water and the water that we use, we are a Colorado River water user. We really don't have other water resources. That water is managed by irrigation districts, or in one case, we have an association. And this is probably the most legal thing that I will say in my presentation, even though I'm an attorney by practice, I'm sort of up here to give an overview of the industry as a whole. But we do have present perfected rights that are either direct diversions off of the river. Some of those go through those districts. And then we do have some groundwater use, but really not a lot. And that's based off of our location on the river. And so it's really dependent on the accounting surface and sort of where that groundwater can be utilized in that way. And we've even been told that in some of those areas where we could utilize groundwater, when we start to think about how we may find other water sources in looking at reductions on the river, is that we're told that accounting surface can move, right? So as soon as we start pumping groundwater in some of these areas, it's very possible that the accounting surface can kind of move to meet us in our activities. So we're very limited in looking at what we can do to replace our water sources. This is just kind of a fun image of our irrigation districts. You'll see Barred Water District on there. That includes a deeded and tribal unit. Those are located in California, but they're growers, the landowners. They are very much connected to Yuma. They're a lot of the same people. And so we kind of include them and really they're covered in any of the information and statistics that I give today. So this is just a clear kind of visual. And then in this map, you can sort of see the production, you know, all of the little green squares in the area with the outlines of the different districts. So this is just a quick breakdown of our district rights. The reason that I did this, and I won't go in detail, is you can see the priorities on the far column showing that we do have some of the most senior rights on the river, and we have relatively large volumes of water that are being used in the districts as well. So looking at, you know, we've talked a lot today about what districts or what farmers can do to sort of reduce their water uses. And so part of that is looking at how they use water, right? How do we apply it? So if you're looking at our irrigation methods, we use flood and furrow irrigation. We use GPS and laser leveling machines to make sure that we're at 0 grade. So even though the idea of that, I think to some people is sort of, we're just throwing a ton of water on a field. This is very precisely done. We have no tailwater or runoff. It's simply a quick irrigation and everything ends up on the field. We have a lot more sprinkler use in recent years. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the efficiency methods, but we use sprinkler, center pivot or linear sprinkler systems. That's pretty limited in our area, and drip irrigation is also pretty limited in our area, but we have some farmers that are looking at that as some funds and other programs have become available. They're really looking at how they can make that work. So in terms of efficiency methods, the reason that we've had some more an increase in sprinkler use is because we've switched to transplants for most of our produce crops. Before we used to plant them by seed, and if you're growing things in a furrow, it takes a lot of water to kind of get that water up to the seed. And so by overhead sprinkling, we really kind of, and using a transplant, we use a lot less water. And so you'll see transplants used a lot more these days than before. Crop varieties, we've changed crops. We've looked at different crops. Kind of farmers are constantly planting test fields and test plots to look at what crops may do better, and just different varieties. Weeding and thinning to eliminate the things that we don't want to grow, right? So by eliminating those, we're having less of a consumptive use. On-farm conservation, system maintenance. So really looking at our irrigation systems and how we can make those the most efficient. Same thing with infrastructure improvements. And I think it's important to add that in the Yuma area, our growers and landowners do a lot of research, either through the assistance of extension and looking at plant disease, pests, crop varieties, like I mentioned earlier, but also looking at our water efficiencies and our kind of salt balance issues that we have. And I'll also mention that our farmers are very much aware of what's going on in the basin, and they've sort of felt for a long time the urban and sort of municipal pressure of feeling like their water is sort of the answer to everyone's problem as these cities grow. And so they've been paying attention for a really long time. And as a result of that, that's why you see a lot of research. That's why you see a lot of the activities that they do, because they want to be able to say that they're doing the best job that they can, obviously self-serving, and that they want to be able to defend themselves, but also because they want to be efficient, because it means less inputs, it means less cost of what you're doing. And so they really do spend a lot of time staying apprised of the situation and researching and looking at those issues. So in terms of water use efficiency, in 2015, we did a study. It's called a case study in efficiency, and then it goes on for several words after that. But our study proved that we are on average 85 to 90% efficient in the Yuma growing area. And by some estimates, we're 75% more efficient than other agriculture in the basin. We've decreased our water use by 18% since 1975, while almost doubling production. And we're working on an updated report. Obviously, the data is now pretty outdated, but we expect to see an increase in productivity, what we call that crop per drop, and the value of that with really the same amount of water or less in some cases being used. Part of our concerns with becoming efficient is that we kind of find ourselves at the end of the river. We end up with a lot of the salts that kind of get added to the system as it comes down, and also just the different uses that add salt to the system. And so our soils are very salty. We spend use some of our water to really work on keeping those salts down. And so we've engaged in this salt balance study to really look at how much water we are applying, and then how does that impact salt, and how does some of our other activities impact those salt loads. And so the study has supported the efficiency findings of our case study. We're 85 to 90% efficient. And we've also learned that we really have to maintain that efficiency to balance salts. So if we became any more efficient, we really would see some heavy salt loads, we'd see lower production, possible impacts to what crops we could grow depending on how heavy those salts got. And so that's also something that we sort of spend a lot of time balancing when we look at what we can do to become more efficient. So the question posed today was thriving with less water. And I think, Yuma is sort of always looking for whether there's room for improvement. I've talked about a lot of the work that we've done. I'm sure that in terms of looking at individual growers, maybe there's some growers that could change some of their practices or look at lining ditches or some of those things. How much water does that produce for the system? I don't know. In terms of fallowing, we have had seasonal fallowing programs in the Bard Water District, and with the Quechan tribe, they have their program as well. We've looked at seasonal fallowing because it really allows that production to be maintained in terms of our winter vegetables and things like that. And you see sort of the things like cotton and wheat and grasses and things come out of production in the summer. And then we have other districts that do rotational fallowing, a lot of citrus. And so as they have to take out old trees, they'll take out those trees, and also alfalfa sort of starting anew, right, with alfalfa. After they've gotten the most cuts that they can get, then we see rotational fallowing there. In terms of retirement of lands, when we're talking about permanent reductions and things like that, you may find farmers that are willing to retire their less productive lands or those soils that are frustrating, right, that don't do as good as the land next to it. And so you could see an interest there. And I know there's a lot of talk about reducing or making reductions in consumptive use. And I just want to point out sort of the uniqueness of water accounting in the Yuma area. We are on the river, and so we have return flows measured, unmeasured. And so when we look at reducing consumptive use, we sort of, by location on the river, we're already sort of reduced in that capacity. And so we have some irrigation districts, they apply 5 acre-feet per acre. Their consumptive use is 1.5 acre-feet out of that 5, and the rest either is returning to the river in measured or unmeasured return flows. We have other districts that it's 2, it's 2.5. So looking at reducing that consumptive use is really difficult when you look at the amount of water that has to be applied, when you look at calculating those return flows. And I'll add that the calculation of those return flows kind of changes year to year, depending on what's going on. And so if you're talking about reducing consumptive use, it gets really difficult for our growers to be able to sort of wrap their head around that and figure out what that's going to look like. So I think in the Yuma area in particular, just to kind of summarize, and in other areas that have done that efficiency work, we couldn't continue to thrive without water. And ultimately, a reduction in water clearly results in a reduction in production. And so I think the question, we talk a lot about beneficial use. And so if we want to have a domestic food supply, if we want to have winter vegetables, and maybe we don't, right? If you asked kids, they would say, no, we don't need any of that, right? But if we wanted to have those things, then I think it's really a question about, do we care about having a domestic food supply? And if we do, then I think it follows that you have to deem agriculture to some extent a beneficial use. And so how do we balance all of those things? And I think Yuma's done a really good job of becoming efficient over time. They've done all that work. And so could we use even less and still do what we do? Probably not, because we've already done that work. But like I mentioned, there's a few things that we look at. We definitely try to be part of the solution where we can be. And so, if you have ideas, you're welcome to come up to me after this and share those ideas, and I'll definitely take those back. And that's all. How to do this.
Wow. Appreciate very much being asked to be here. This is important to farmers. We've become part of the discussion, part of the solution. And I'm not going to try to refute pieces of this other presentations. I will tell you that from the farm perspective, the Pacific Core and the New York Times are not exactly our idea of veracity. So take that with a grain of salt. But what's going to happen in the future is this debate over the 2026 reallocations and discussion on the Colorado River. I am currently the president of the Family Farm Alliance, and we represent farmers in the 16 western states. We've testified almost 100 times to Congress in the last few years. We're bipartisan. Our reputation in DC is solutions. And part of the discussion we're going to have here, I have so many notes that could take a couple hours, but the reality is we know that something different is happening. And I've been involved in discussions on the Colorado River essentially my whole life or adult life and trying to figure out what the solutions are. Things have changed in a very fundamental way, in a way that last winter was the worst winter from Elko, Nevada to Rawlins, Wyoming in the history of the Colorado River Basin that I'm aware of. It was chilling, and I can't give you enough explanations of how bad it was. Lost livestock, and the farmers and the ranchers will tell you how tough it was. We lost 90% of the wildlife. Huge swaths of country that we don't know whether we'll ever get back because of the, the volatility of what climate's going to mean in the future. So let me introduce real quickly my wife, Sharon, and my granddaughter, Siobhan. if you want to know what farmers care about, it's that next generation. So Siobhan is the oldest of the 6th generation on our ranch. And what do? We want them to be there on the ground. Megan, daughter of a farmer, boy, her parents were so proud of her. And so the Family Farm Alliance is just that, family. So 99% of farmers are families. And this idea that we're some kind of a huge bunch of corporations floating around, that isn't true. We're individual families that care about something that we think is good, producing food for America, right? And the downsides of some of the implications of things like redefining alfalfa as a non-beneficial use. Oh my God. It's the baseline, it's the bottom of the food pyramid. And yet we're all of a sudden demonizing alfalfa and by extension demonizing farmers. And it just breaks your heart. And so when I come here, it isn't just with, I have a million good stories to tell you. And I think that my whole career is built on partnerships, how we work together. James used a quote that our community uses: people support what they help create. And that comes from the best conservation genius on the Colorado River, this in Baggs, Wyoming, that I get to work with every day. And when we get together, my friend Daryl, we've been talking a little bit, when we get together and work together, and that was the beauty of that panel yesterday. After all of what's happened in the West, what's happened to your tribes, what was the word that was overwhelming? Partnerships. How can we put our hand out and work together, right? And that's the future. And I've seen it happen so often where, our community is the largest river restoration in the country, I think, and the largest trout passage in the country. Laura Zemer, my friend, we sat at a Senate hearing together. And, I'm the farmer and she's Trout Unlimited, and the senator said, "You're friends?" Yeah, we're friends because we're all working together, right? Jennifer, how many years have we worked together, Jennifer? And part of what I've been able to do in the last few years, I was chair of a group called the Intermountain West Joint Venture, which is migratory birds. And we developed a lot of process. We came out with data in the last couple of days that Jennifer will talk about. 61% of the migratory birds are dependent on irrigated agriculture. And when we start talking about taking the water away permanently, that whole thing falls apart. And it falls apart fast. So when you take that irrigated water, both the fish and the birds disappear because it's this system, and you want to use 75% or 80% of the water. In California, it's 41. But it's because we don't understand the implications of what agriculture does for us and what our own belief system, we as farmers and ranchers believe in these systems. I love the land like you love the land, right? So this is what I look at out of my front door every morning. My door is in Wyoming, that mountain is in Colorado. And so you asked a few of the things that we're doing. So we're putting in pipe in our ditch that irrigates our alfalfa to make a little bit more efficiency there. We have a whole list of, that mountain right there on the backside is the largest population of grouse in Colorado. East of there is the only place that I'm aware of where sharptails and greater sage-grouse lek together because it's right on the edge of the forest and the sage-grouse system. When you go north, we have a demonstration project with the Fish and Wildlife Service that we've had hundreds of people on how you integrate irrigation and fishery. And, farmers are doing that all over. Farmers are figuring out there isn't the water that we used to have, right? And so what are we doing? We're reacting. We're trying to figure out. And last year, we're the first irrigators on the Colorado River Yampa system. Last year, we got about 20% of the water in the fall. We did no second irrigation. We left what was left for the fish because there just wasn't any use. And if we'd have gone from that 20% fall through another dry season, we wouldn't be here talking like we are today. We'd be in such crisis we couldn't even stand it. And that could happen. The volatility of the system, and I was hoping Brad would be here because he and I have talked with each other for years and years, and I listened to him. And what I saw last winter, with the winter that we had in that 4-state swath, our biggest fears about climate are not enough. It's worse than that. And it's going to be worse than that. It's particularly going to be worse than that for farmers, because we rely on some level of sustainability and predictability. That's gone. There's no predictability anymore. We react to what's going to happen in the future. And I think Family Farm Alliance, we wrote a paper on climate in 2007 when nobody was writing papers on the agricultural side, because we knew what was happening. And what did we do? We said we need to do infrastructure. And then what did we do last year? What did we do last year? We put 200 groups of people together, and you hear about the $4 billion that we were on the call, having an argument about permanent versus non-permanent reductions. We got $8.3 billion that we don't even talk about for infrastructure. So there's $12.3 billion sitting in a bank somewhere. I want to know where it's going to be spent. And so what am I doing as a person in our community? The next, if you want to put the next slide up. Yeah, I got to have my granddaughter to do any of that. So we're surrounded by the Route Medicine Bow National Forest. It's the headwaters of the Yampa. It's like that. The whole thing is like that. And Professor Squalacci knows when you go to Laramie and turn left and go over the snowy range and that beautiful road, the whole forest is like that. And why is that? So in a conversation I had with one of the highest ranking members of this administration, he said, Pat, would you and the family farm help us, because the NEPA is being administered so badly that we can't get anything done. That's the reality. That's what we need to be talking about here. Why can't the group that I've helped form, called the Headwaters of the Colorado, that's going to try to fix this damn thing, because the water coming out of the forest is the water for the Colorado River, for all of us. And when you want to talk about the environmental parts, I thought the secretary skipped over it a little bit. Critical, because it's all interconnected, and Jennifer knows that. It's all interconnected. And we've done our job for a lifetime, being the stewards of the land. It's like Daryl has. And I can't tell you again how much I was impressed by that presentation yesterday of people speaking from the heart. So I have a couple sayings that I've developed. One is called the unsustainable megalopoli. So when you look at the future, trying to look into the future, what is the possible outcome of giving more water to growth? And I call, Utah, Salt Lake, here, Phoenix. It just, you look at it, how is it going to sustain itself? And now the Phoenix has finally realized it doesn't have the water to sustain itself for growth. What would happen if the 70% of irrigation or the water that was in the hands of farmers was in the hands of developers? What would happen? We would have already gone through it. And so maybe we have 10 or 15 years, because right now the laws are designed to advance the needs of the developers. So Denver, double. I was at the hearing that the secretary said 2 to 4 million acre feet. I was at that hearing. It was interesting. The next person was Mr. Enspinger, who said Las Vegas, 2.2 to 3.8. The next person was a person from a group who has a way to start measuring water that'll certainly make the farmers nervous, because it's really not a tool for how to evaluate the whole systems that I'm trying to talk about: birds, fish, food, all those things. But it's a system of figuring out how we can empower those people who want to come against ag water and take our water away. And I'm going to say something that really is, I hate to say it, but I'm going to say it, because the secretary, what the secretary did, and I don't think he's here, but what he did, I was out on the transition team. Western governors asked me to be on the transition team when Mr. Clinton got in. So I sat through those meetings. And on the very last night, I was knee to knee with Mr. Leshy, and John Eckerhawk was there. John and I have done several things together. And he said, we're going to get the loggers, the miners, and the ranchers. And he put Dan Beard in charge of the Bureau of Reclamation. And, that was war. So the war on the West started that day. And it just kept going and going and going. And so some of the people that are on the left right now that we worry about, Western Watershed, Center for Biological Diversity, look up, what's his name? The guy from the Idaho Statesman wrote a letter about the executive director of the Western Watersheds, who sues people like us, who sued our family. And they said, he said, suing ranchers is like putting smallpox in the blankets of Indians. So you ask why we're upset. You ask why we are angry. When you talk about the fundamental principles of producing food in this country, and I talked about this at our Family Farm Alliance meeting, the farmers who have left California, driven out by a whole lot of, you identified, James, a lot of the reasons why they left, and everything from labor to dollars, politics, went to Mexico, Peru, Guatemala. They're all over the hemisphere trying to keep farming because they want to farm, because they love land, right? They love producing food. They have to pay what do they call them, the cartels to go in. So if you're a farmer from California, Arizona, left because you couldn't make it work here, you pay the cartels to go in, and then you pay a truck by truck payment to the cartels to go out with the fresh vegetables that we used to produce for ourselves. Think about that. The Mexican cartels now control our food policy. 90% of our winter vegetables, many of whom, as Megan so articulately talked about, is happening in Yuma and the Central Valley. And, we're in a fight, and we know that. And we're trying to, I told my kids when they wanted to come back, I said, if you don't want to fight, don't come back, because it's been that way all along. And John and I were on the Western Water Policy Commission, right, John? And the only other farmer on it was Ken Salazar. Ken came up to me and he said, Pat, I have to leave because I want to be a U.S. Senator, and this isn't the way we're going to get there, because it was about taking water from ag, right? I was on another commission with the Johnson Foundation. They thought they were going to solve the water problems. And the first sentence out of their mouth was, we'll get rid of prior appropriation. So every single step, this is one more step along that whole line of fighting for the resource that we think we've done a pretty good job. And so we have to kind of reevaluate, as I say it, what's the West we want? Because if we don't act differently, we'll get the West we deserve, which isn't one that we want. And it's crisis time. We know that. This winter gave most of us a little respite because there's so much snow. But I will tell you one last story. And day before yesterday, I was getting ready to plant the dreaded alfalfa on a no-till field. And no-till means you don't, plow and do all that stuff. And in June, after the biggest water year in the history of the Colorado rivers in our part of the country, the drill couldn't penetrate the ground because it was so hard. And luckily, we got a rain the next day, and so we were able to plant. But what does that tell you? What does that tell you? It's that the hydrology is totally different. In the ground, Brad talked about aridification. I've been talking for 5 years, why are my springs dried up? What does that mean? That's the indicator of what is going to happen in the future, because the water wants to go into the ground before it goes to the reservoirs. And so we're going to come to the Family Farm Alliance in February, because we're going to evaluate all of the programs, the failed systems conservation. A couple of people in our community are getting $615 an acre for a program that won't make any difference on the Colorado River. And we know that. And what we're going to try to do is evaluate the things that work and try to make suggestions about what could work. But when you look at that picture, that is failed policy. That is failed policy that the Forest Service has been given. Senator Bennett was in our community recently. He put a $60 billion tag on how do we fix these forests. That's the picture that when I testified to Senator Manchin and Barrasso's committee last year twice, Senator Manchin finally said, we've given you the money, we've given you the direction, and we're telling you what to do, we're not asking you. Because this is our water supply. This is the headwaters of the Colorado River. Looks like that for hundreds of thousands of acres. And those who have some responsibility for the NEPA system being so unusable that nothing is getting done, that's a huge responsibility. And we have to, in groups like this with the intellectual power that's in this room, have to realize that when the highest levels of the Department of Ag and Interior, I talked to Tom Vilsack about this stuff, they're going, please help us because we can't get projects done because NEPA is not being applied the way it was intended. We've got to come together with solutions. Thank you. It's been a great opportunity.
You want me to do this, Mark?
Sure.
All right. We have Matt Mosley, who has been recruited to go through the questions. And Matt?
You betcha.
Fire
Our
away.
slide has been lighting up during this panel, and I'm sure they asked me to facilitate the agriculture panel because of my love of gardening and keeping my wife's geraniums watered. So let's go to the first question here, and that'll be for you, Professor Squillace. Some of your suggestions for updating state water law in the basin would likely be challenged as a taking. Can you speak to that?
Sure. Is this on? Yeah. Okay, so first of all, I want to be clear, and I think Secretary Babbitt made this point, and I want to reiterate what he was saying, is that most of what I'm proposing would be voluntary kinds of reductions. And so, you know, we have $4 billion from the federal government to help deal with some of the crisis on the Colorado River. And, you know, I don't know that that would be enough money necessarily, but the idea would be, certainly at the beginning, to sort of seek voluntary reductions in consumption. And I want to emphasize something. I know Pat and I disagree about a number of these things, but the topic here that we're trying to discuss is how to make agriculture thrive with less water. And I think that is really the focus of what I'm trying to say. I am not trying to suggest that we should in some ways undermine irrigated agriculture. I think that it is important to all of us, but it's also important that we deal with the crisis that we have on the Colorado River and the water shortages. So my idea is to seek voluntary reductions. I don't know that necessarily there would be a taking, even if these were not voluntary. I don't want to suggest that that's the way we should go here, but I want to be clear that government regulation of land and other kinds of things happens all the time in ways that can affect the value of your property. So I don't want to leave the impression that I think any sort of regulation of water that might limit the amount of water that you could use would necessarily be a taking. But I also certainly don't think that we should start by trying to restrict somebody's water right. I think there are a lot of voluntary opportunities where we can really generate a lot of water to provide for other kinds of needs and uses, including the needs, by the way, of the many Native American tribes that have not had their rights satisfied.
Great. Thank you very much. You know, there's quite a few questions about crop switching and alfalfa. So I'll throw this one out, that alfalfa is not the only forage available for stock. There's beet pulp and sorghum, and they're less water intensive alternatives. So what would it take to switch?
Well, part of it's profitability, and alfalfa is not only profitable, particularly in the lower basin where multiple crops, but it's the thing that makes milk and butter and all the things that we're going to go upstairs and eat. And we've kind of demonized this idea that this is some kind of a criminal crop, when in fact, let me tell you a story. Last year, my wife and I went to Ireland at a sustainable grazing deal that there was 46 countries there. And it just so happened that it was the day that people were pouring milk on the floor of stores in both London and New York about how bad milk was. And this fellow from Kenya got up and he said, all we want is one glass of milk a day so we don't have malnutrition. I mean, the disconnect between the value of a crop that's a magical crop that does so many things and how we're going to switch a crop. Does it mean that we're going to make money for that crop? That becomes the bigger issue, because in a conversation with Senator Vilsack 3 years ago at CSU, where they didn't have any ag people talking about water, I said, you know, only 2% of us are feeding the rest of us. And he said, Pat, it's 1% and declining, less than 1% and declining. And we've got to realize that our farmers are walking away because of this constant sort of misinformation that's going on about what we do. But what a farmer is trying to do is make enough money to pay the bank. And by the way, bankers don't give a damn about conservation. They give a damn about making sure that they get paid back. And so our job as farmers and ranchers is to try to figure out a way to pay our bills every year, and whatever that appropriate crop is. And I will tell you, in this terrible winter that we had, the price of alfalfa doubled. So not only was it devastating because we had to feed every single animal, we had to pay and double what the values were this last fall.
Great. Well, now that you're handing the microphone to Megan, I'll throw this question to you. In Yuma, alfalfa is still the most prominent crop. What is the district doing to reduce the dependence on water-heavy alfalfa?
First, I would disagree that it's the most prominent crop, and I would be interested, whoever asked that question, where they got that information. So that's kind of the first response to that question. So, I mean, predominantly we grow produce, and I would say that, you know, in terms of crop switching, that crop switching in the Yuma area happened some time ago when we shifted to growing vegetables in the winter. And so, you know, are we crop switching now? No. Have we done it in the past? Yes. And I think to Pat's, you know, point about marketability and there being a demand and a need for a certain product or a certain crop, I mean, there's always a willingness, at least in the Yuma area, to look at that and see what that would look like and see if there's a market for that. I've never heard of people feeding their animals beet pulp, and that doesn't mean that they don't do it, but I've never heard that. And so, you know, we don't grow a lot of alfalfa, and that's why I sort of handed the mic to Pat, who has direct experience with that. But I mean, I think as long as there's an animal that'll eat it and you can make a profit and pay your bills, that, you know, farmers are always going to be open to that. So I think it's just a question of, you know, we talk a lot about communication and partnerships and things like that. And so that if people have ideas, if they've done the research, if they know where the market is, right, reach out and have that conversation and see if you can build a partnership on that. But I think, you know, farmers generally do what they know, and they change as soon as they find out that something's going to do a better job, right? So I think just sharing information if it's out there, right? Like now I know that you can feed cows beet pulp, and I didn't know that before. So I think just having those conversations goes a long way.
Great. While you had the mic, there's a couple of questions about sort of the international versus domestic dynamic. And could you maybe speak a little bit about how much of Yuma's products are international versus domestic?
So I don't know those statistics. I can say that the produce grown in Mexico is usually shipped to the Yuma area to be processed in our facilities there. I don't know what the percentage of that is, but I would say that the majority is still grown in the Yuma area during that time and sort of supplemented with product from Mexico to kind of fill the market needs. But
Great. Jim, we'll throw this one to you since you did some great research about markets. And, you know, crop switching does require changing and different alternatives. And what could be done to develop more markets for more products? And then a kind of a follow-up question would be, could geographically focused federal subsidies drive more appropriate crop choices?
I think certainly there is a need to develop new markets. It's one of the issues that got talked about in the exercise we went through in the Grand Junction area, where, you know, we had 40, 50 people in the room, and probably about a third of them were ranchers, third of them were farmers, several ranchers, and then just community leaders in general. And a real theme for that, well, there are two biggest themes. One was we need to increase our collaboration, but the second theme was we need to develop new markets, and there was a particular interest in developing local markets, that if we could find in our region folks to consume what we produce, and if we could produce the things that folks in our region consumed, we'd be closer to the customer. It would deal with this us versus them. Folks would have a better understanding of agriculture. But part of that interest was to also experiment with drought-tolerant crops and create markets for it. So I think there is a real need for research to go to that. I think the University Cooperative Extensions already do some of this work, but I think we should emphasize this more. But it has to be done with a recognition of don't expect someone to switch to a crop there's not a market for. Don't expect someone to switch to a crop that requires a labor force they don't have, or equipment that they already owe the bank for the equipment they have. And so I suppose where we might need subsidies, I'm not sure if it's a direct crop subsidy. I will refer more to our agricultural folks in the panel here, but I think what it could be is a subsidy that goes more directly to those mechanisms, to helping, create the market, to helping expand the market, to we will help pay off your debt on the equipment we're wanting you to not use anymore because we want you to get new equipment. Solving the border issue so we can have a labor force that is more mobile would be a massive difference. So I think those kind of things may be more valuable than what should the crop subsidy be for cotton versus some other crop.
Great.
So when we were at our meeting in Ireland, the head of the Department of Agriculture in Ireland came up to me and said, hey man, you were going to be so surprised. We just cut a deal that we are going to bring Irish lamb into the United States. And by the way, the British cut a deal also because of Brexit that they're going to bring lamb into the United States. Our prices are plummeting. We don't want subsidies. We want markets that are fair. And, I just saw a thing recently that they were going to bring in Paraguayan beef because we're going to have a tight beef supply. That'll make sure that the remaining generation of Nazis in Paraguay get access to our markets. It's complicated, but why is it that American farmers aren't prospering right now? Is a lot of it is federal policy, and frankly, this administration has some great ideas, terrible implementation, and we've got to figure out a way because of government. Throughout, you go back to Babylon, the government that doesn't want its agriculture will lose it. It only sustains itself when you have government that supports it. And we have to be thinking, because of the decline in farmers that I've talked about earlier, we're not talking these people into coming back. Shaban is an exception, not the rule. Farmers talk about, we don't want our kids to come back, there's no future in it. Boy, that is a heartbreak to society. So we have to kind of come up with a system where the government says, hey, we don't want the cartels telling us how much vegetables we bring in every year. We'd rather get them from Yuma.
Well, I've kind of a follow-up on that question, and if anybody wants to take it, Mark, and it's really, Pat, addressed to you, but I think anyone can answer it, and it is, we hear you, but there's less water. What are the best ways for farm and ranch communities to survive?
Well, I'll start just because, one thing I didn't say that I meant to, we always talk about the Israelis or figured it out. The Israelis come to the Central Valley to talk to my guys about how you use less water, micro irrigation. And so we're the cutting edge of that stuff. And it isn't, there's no sort of outside smart people that are doing it the right way. We're doing it the right way. We just are in a really imperfect. And with the less water, as I told you, last year, only 20% of the headwaters of the Colorado River was available to me. So we're going to use what we get, right? Isn't that right? We're going to use what we get. And we're going to make the most of it, probably the most intellectually validly that anybody could do it, because that's what we do. We've done it the greatest history of food supply in the history of the world.
Can I just, I want to kind of go back a little bit, I guess, to the question about crop switching, and hopefully this will address the point that Pat just made as well. First, let me just emphasize again that I'm all about having this be a voluntary program. I don't think that this is something I'm suggesting that we mandate that farmers switch crops or do anything else to save water. But I also don't think we should think about this in terms of telling a farmer they should grow this crop or that crop. That's not the point. We're talking about trying to reduce consumption. And if a farmer is willing voluntarily to give up some of their water, they can decide for themselves if they want to continue to grow alfalfa, maybe with some way that they're not consuming as much water, or to switch to a different crop that doesn't consume as much water, or change that over time. But the point is that we've got to get more water back into the system because we just don't have enough water. And as we've talked about for the last 2 days, a big problem is we haven't even satisfied the needs of those Native American communities that deserve to get treated fairly and get their fair amount of water. So these are hard questions, and I certainly don't want to suggest that that there's any easy solutions to them. But I think there are ways that we can sort of think about this where we're not hurting farmers in any way. We're giving them a chance to figure out a way to continue to thrive as farmers and yet use less water. They do it voluntarily. Maybe they switch crops. Maybe they switch to this crop or that crop. They decide. The market helps them determine where they're going to go. But I want to just be clear that this is not about trying to mandate any particular behavior on the part of the ag community. That's I think it's not going to work for one thing, but I also think it would not be successful.
So I think I'll just add, I think echoing some of Secretary Babbitt's comments this morning, I mean, I think looking at programs that work for agriculture in the different areas is really important. So in the Yuma area, in particular, one example is the Metropolitan Water District programs with the Bard Water District and the Quetzon tribe. They came to us and said, hey, we want to have this partnership. What can that look like? And how can you develop a program that works for you? And so we really worked out a program that worked for us. And for us, it was seasonal fallowing. And, we fallow for 4 months out of the year. And that worked. It worked almost on a financial basis, right? I think the growers in that area weren't out to make a profit on the fallowing program. They really saw it as an opportunity to contribute, right? To contribute to solving the problem and leaving more water in the system. But enough money to where they could kind of make it through the summer months. And a big part of that program also was that a significant portion of it, 25%, the grower gave that up. That was left with the irrigation district. And now the irrigation district uses that money to make capital improvements to the system. So we're lining canals, we're fixing some of our check structures and those things in the district that for Bard were 80 to 90 years old and we're still dirt lined, right? So we've been making these improvements at the same time. And so while those savings are not necessarily calculated into that program, because we've had that inflow of money, we've been able to make those improvements also. So we're conserving water in the fallowing program, and we're really sort of secondarily conserving water by updating our system. And so I think that's a really good example of an entity who either was trying to contribute in some sort of system conservation way, or they were trying to replace supplies, that they were maybe losing as there was less water available, but really came to us and said, what would work for you? What would that look like? And we made that work. And so I think that program in particular is a great example of how you sort of deal with two issues at the same time, right? You're reducing water in terms of growth, but you're also sort of making it possible for those irrigation districts to improve their systems. But I think it's important to always understand that those programs can be in place, but there's still a trade-off. So you're still losing the production in those 4 months out of the year. And maybe that's okay, right? And that's comes down to the market and what's the demand and what do people want to eat and are people willing to sacrifice having certain things, right? Like if we all decided we didn't need vegetables in the winter, then maybe that's okay. So I think there's always a balance of looking at when you make those, when you put those programs into place, they're great, and you do it in such a way that allows farmers to still sort of thrive in terms of being able to financially make it. And that our economy, and at least in Yuma, is largely supported by agriculture. And so if you see significant reductions there, then you see sort of the ripple effect of that in our town. And growing up there, like, I don't want it to turn into some place that I don't want to live, right? Because then you have people that don't want to come home and be in their communities. So I think there's work that can be done, there's programs that can be established, and it comes down to conversations and figuring out how do we do that, and how do we do it on a scale where you don't entirely, lose an economy in a rural area.
I think one of the conclusions I come to as I reflect on a whole variety of the issues is I think we need a new social compact. And I'm not talking about a new Colorado River compact. It's a much larger social compact of we are increasing our demands. We're having a significant reduction in our supply. We need to, in many fundamental ways, rethink how we make these choices. And I think that I'm an advocate for that our water resources are in the public interest. Yes, it means something to have a senior right, but it doesn't mean you can do whatever you darn well please with that senior right. So I think we need more collaboration. We need collaboration between the growing communities and the farmers in the region. And you've already seen some of that, and where, okay, we will invest in conservation, and the water saved by the conservation can go to the city, and the farmer is now producing crops, with additional investment to improve efficiency. We're going to need to see a lot more of that kind of thing. And I think what that's going to require is a much more collaborative relationship between all of our major water users. But in particular, in this case, I think it's we're talking about agriculture. I think there needs to be an acceptance of I don't want it to be rules and regulations, but in some form, a higher level of social guidance. If we're going to make major investments in keeping that water flowing, if we're going to make major investments in rehabilitating infrastructure, making it more efficient, figuring out maybe lower water use crops, there needs to be a deal of what are the kind of trade-offs that happen with that. So I would say that's a kind of conversation we need to start having.
Great. Before we break, Pat, did you want to have one final word?
One last comment, and maybe I haven't done the job I hoped I would do to make you understand how scary the food supply is. The lowest wheat production in the United States since 1917, because much of what climate has done in other parts of the West is the dryland wheat didn't happen. What's happening in Ukraine? You take it 10 different ways. We are going to be bending over backwards sometime, I think, hope in my lifetime, going, my God, we can't lose any more farmers. And so how we allocate the water, 70% of the people in the eastern slope of Colorado in a recent poll said, we don't want to take water away from ag for growth. And most of the people over here don't even know that it's ag water that fuels the growth of this place. And so we have to just kind of get people educated as to what's really happening, and then make our suggestion based on those realities.
Thank you very much, Pat. There's one more little question that snuck in here. It's just a joke, but it's from Andy Mueller, I think, about why don't oysters share their pearls? It's because they're shellfish. Great. And with that note, thank you very much to our panelists.
I know it's time to break for lunch. I just want to sort of acknowledge something, which is that I've learned an important lesson from this panel, which is that if you're trying to sell a controversial idea, don't start with a slide from the New York Times. And so try to keep that in mind for future panels.
And as we break for lunch too, let's just give it up for everybody and Annie Carlozzi. Yes. The food has been terrific here. So thank you very much, Doug.